A view from the Rectory gate, a Mr. James story. I have always maintained that the pursuit of antiquarian research, while deeply rewarding to the scholarly mind, occasionally leads one into territories where prudence might counsel retreat. The incident I am about to relate occurred during the autumn of 1923, when I had occasion to visit the ruins of Gormley Abbey in the remote corner of Suffolk that borders upon Norfolk. The invitation came from my old Cambridge colleague, Dr. Pemberton, who had recently been appointed to the living at Little Gormley and found himself in possession of certain historical materials that he thought might interest me. The journey from London proved more circuitous than anticipated. The branch line from Ipswich terminates at Saxmundham, and from there one must rely upon the twice-weekly motor coach that serves the scattered villages of that sparsely populated district. It was a grey October afternoon when I alighted at Little Gormley, a hamlet consisting of perhaps 24 cottages, a Norman church much restored by Victorian enthusiasm, and the Rectory, a substantial Georgian house of pleasing proportions that commanded an excellent view across the water meadows to the abbey ruins some half-mile distant. Pemberton met me at the village green with his characteristic warmth, though I noted he appeared rather more careworn than when last we had met at the Oriental Institute. His hair, once a vigorous brown, had acquired streaks of premature grey, and there was about his eyes a quality of watchfulness that had not been there before. "Delighted you could come, Harrington," said he, grasping my hand with perhaps unnecessary firmness. "I trust the journey wasn't too frightful. These country connections are rather trying, I'm afraid, but there's compensation in the solitude. One can think clearly here, away from the noise of Cambridge and London." As we walked toward the Rectory, he gestured across the meadows toward the abbey ruins, which stood silhouetted against the darkening sky like the ribs of some great beast. "Gormley Abbey," he said, and I thought I detected a note of unease in his voice. Founded in 1174 by Roger de Gormley, dissolved under Henry VIII in 1539. Most of it was pulled down for building stone, but enough remains to give one a sense of its former grandeur. The locals tend to avoid it after dark. Superstition, of course, but rather persistent superstition. The Rectory proved comfortable enough, and Mrs. Pemberton, a sensible woman of middle years, provided an excellent dinner. It was not until we had retired to Pemberton's study, with its walls lined floor to ceiling with theological works and archaeological monographs, that he broached the matter that had prompted his invitation. "I wrote to you about the brass rubbing," he began, settling into his chair before the fire. "It's in the vestry at present. Quite remarkable, really. Medieval, certainly, and in exceptional condition considering it's lain neglected in what remains of the abbey's chapter house for the better part of 4 centuries. He rose and withdrew from a cabinet a portfolio of stiff paper, which he opened with evident care. The rubbing within was indeed striking. A full-length effigy of a robed figure, hands clasped in prayer, the details rendered with that peculiar precision that characterizes the best medieval brass work. The inscription below was in Gothic lettering, much of it clearly legible: Hic Jacet, Frater Augustinus de Mortuo, Mari qui obi, Anno Domini MCCC. "Brother Augustine of the Dead Sea," I murmured, studying the Latin. "The date appears to be early 15th century, though the final digits are rather unclear. Have you been able to determine anything more about this individual?" Pemberton's expression grew troubled. "That's rather the difficulty," he replied. "I've consulted every source I can lay hands upon, the dissolution records, the episcopal registers, even the chronicle of St. Edmund's at Bury, and there's no mention of any Brother Augustine connected with Gormley Abbey. It's as though he never existed, or as though his memory was deliberately suppressed. This was indeed curious. Medieval records, particularly those relating to religious foundations, are generally quite comprehensive regarding their personnel. For a figure significant enough to merit a brass memorial to vanish so completely from the documentary record suggested either unusual circumstances or a systematic effort at erasure. The brass itself, you've examined it thoroughly as circumstances permit. It was found last spring when young Fletcher from the village was exploring the ruins. You know how boys are about such places. Despite all warnings, he came running to me in considerable distress, claiming the thing had moved while he was making the rubbing. Nonsense, of course, but the boy was genuinely frightened. I went myself the following day and completed the work. A most unsettling experience, I must confess. I looked up from the rubbing with interest. Unsettling in what way? Pemberton hesitated, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. It's difficult to articulate precisely. The chapter house, where the brass is located, it's the most intact portion of the abbey ruins, with 3 walls still standing nearly to their full height. But the acoustics are peculiar. One hears things, echoes where there should be none, sounds that might be wind but don't quite. Well, I'm sure you'll judge for yourself tomorrow. I've arranged with Fletcher's father to borrow his son's bicycle, so you can cycle over at your leisure. The evening concluded with a glass of port and some discussion of mutual acquaintances at Cambridge, but I could not entirely dispel the impression that Pemberton was holding something back. There was a tension about him, a quality of suppressed unease that seemed connected with the abbey ruins, visible from his study window. When I retired, I drew the curtains firmly closed, though whether this was due to the chill October air or some less rational motive, I could not have said. My room was comfortable, with a cheerful fire in the grate and shelves lined with an eclectic selection of books, theology, history, and a surprising number of works on folklore and local superstition. Before settling for the night, I examined more closely the brass rubbing Pemberton had lent me for study. The craftsmanship was indeed exceptional, but there was something about the figure's expression that troubled me. The eyes, though rendered in the conventional medieval style, seemed to possess an unsettling intensity, and the hands, while positioned in the traditional attitude of prayer, appeared somehow grasping rather than supplicant. I slept poorly that first night, troubled by dreams I could not quite recall upon waking, save for a persistent sense of being observed from a great distance across dark water. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, with that peculiar quality of light that autumn brings to the English countryside, everything rendered sharp and distinct, yet somehow fragile, as though the landscape itself were aware of approaching winter. Mrs. Pemberton provided an excellent breakfast, and Pemberton himself seemed rather more cheerful in daylight, though I noticed he took care to keep his back to the window that faced the abbey ruins. "You'll find the cycling pleasant enough," he said, as I prepared to depart. "The lane runs straight across the meadows. It was the old Pilgrim Road, in fact, before the dissolution put an end to such traffic. The abbey ruins are clearly visible once you cross the bridge over Gormley Beck. The chapter house stands at the southeast corner of the cloister garth. You can't mistake it." He paused, his hand upon the latch of the garden gate. "I should mention, if you encounter any of the local people near the ruins, don't be surprised if they seem rather reticent. There are stories, you understand, foolish stories, but persistent ones, the usual rural nonsense about lights in the ruins and voices heard after dark. Mrs. Grimsby, at the post office, is particularly given to such fancies. The bicycle proved serviceable enough, and the ride across the meadows was indeed pleasant. The lane was well maintained, bordered by ancient hedgerows heavy with blackthorn and rose hips. Gormley Beck, when I reached it, proved to be a modest stream meandering through water meadows that showed signs of recent flooding. The bridge was medieval, its weathered stones testament to the centuries of pilgrims who had passed this way. From the bridge, Gormley Abbey presented a striking prospect. What remained of the great church rose like a broken giant from the surrounding meadows. Portions of the nave walls, the base of the central tower, and the entire eastern end, with its soaring chancery windows, now open to the sky. But it was the conventual buildings that drew my attention, for here the ruins were more complete. The chapter house, as Pemberton had indicated, was readily identifiable, a rectangular structure with 3 walls standing nearly intact, their Gothic windows still preserving traces of stone tracery. I left the bicycle beside what had once been the gatehouse and approached the ruins on foot. The autumn grass was long and thick with moisture, and my footsteps made little sound as I walked among the fallen stones. There was a profound silence about the place, not the comfortable quiet of the countryside, but something deeper and more absolute, as though the very air retained some memory of the religious observances that had once sanctified these grounds. The chapter house was larger than it had appeared from a distance. Its surviving walls rose to a height of perhaps 20 feet, and the vaulted ceiling, though now open in several places, still suggested the former grandeur of the space. The floor was stone-flagged, much worn by centuries of monastic feet, and it was here, near the eastern wall where the abbot's chair would have stood, that I found the brass. It was set into a stone slab that had clearly served as someone's tomb, though the surrounding floor showed signs of having been disturbed and relaid, possibly during the dissolution, when so many monastic treasures were hastily concealed or removed. The brass itself was in remarkable condition, the figure standing out boldly against the dark metal, every detail of the robes and facial features clearly defined. I unpacked my materials and set about the work of rubbing. It is a task requiring patience and care. The paper must be positioned exactly, the rubbing wax applied with consistent pressure to avoid smudging or gaps. As I worked, I became increasingly absorbed in the details revealed by the process. The figure's robes were decorated with an intricate pattern that might have been stars or flowers. The medieval fondness for symbolic detail made such ambiguity common. More interesting was the inscription around the border, which proved more extensive than the portion visible in Pemberton's rubbing. Easit frater Augustinus de mortuo mari, que obiet anno domini mccx 12 in festo sancti Michaelis archangeli. I read aloud, my voice echoing strangely in the empty chamber. Orate pro anima ies, ne, in perpetuum damnatus sit. The date was now clear, 1412, but it was the final phrase that gave me pause. Pray for his soul, lest he be damned forever. This was not the conventional formula found on medieval brasses, which typically requested prayers for the departed soul, or commended him to divine mercy. The suggestion of potential eternal damnation was unusual, to say the least. As I continued working, gradually extending my rubbing to capture the full inscription, I became aware of a curious acoustic phenomenon. The chapter house, with its high walls and partial vaulting, created an echo that seemed to linger longer than natural. When I spoke aloud, as one does unconsciously when absorbed in solitary work, the words returned to me with a peculiar hollow quality, as though issuing from some great depth. It was while extending the rubbing to include some decorative elements around the border that I made the most disturbing discovery. The brass, I realized, was incomplete. The figure's left hand, which in Pemberton's rubbing had appeared to be clasped in prayer with the right, was in fact reaching towards something that was no longer there. The metal showed clear signs of having been cut, deliberately severed with considerable skill, leaving only the hand and wrist of what had evidently been a second figure. This was extraordinary. Medieval brasses occasionally depicted married couples or religious figures in groups, but the deliberate mutilation of such a monument suggested something more troubling. Who had been depicted beside Brother Augustine, and why had that portion of the brass been so carefully removed? I was examining the cut edge of the metal, trying to determine what tools might have been employed for such precise work, when I heard the sound that has haunted me ever since. It was a soft rustling, as though someone in long robes was moving across the stone flags behind me. I turned immediately, but the chapter house was empty. The sound continued for perhaps 3 heartbeats more, then ceased abruptly. The silence that followed seemed deeper than before, charged with a quality of expectation that made me intensely uncomfortable. I looked again at the brass, and for one unsettling moment, the bronze figure seemed to possess a 3-dimensional quality, as though it were not a flat representation, but an actual form lying recumbent upon the stone. The impression lasted only an instant, but it was sufficiently disturbing to make me pack my materials with rather more haste than the work warranted. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something I had previously overlooked. In the southeast corner of the chapter house, partially concealed by fallen masonry, was what appeared to be the entrance to a crypt or undercroft. The opening was narrow and dark, blocked by fallen stones, but there was unmistakably a passage beyond. Medieval chapter houses sometimes included crypts for the burial of abbots or other significant figures, but this opening seemed different, more deliberately concealed than merely blocked by the natural decay of centuries. The ride back to the rectory was accomplished without incident, though I found myself glancing back repeatedly toward the abbey ruins. In the afternoon light, they appeared completely benign, ancient stones warmed by autumn sunshine, no different from dozens of similar sites scattered across England. Yet I could not entirely dispel the memory of that rustling sound, or the momentary impression that the brass figure had achieved some form of independent existence. Pemberton was waiting for me in his study, and I could see from his expression that he was eager for my report. I showed him the extended rubbing, pointing out the unusual inscription and the evidence of deliberate mutilation. Someone removed the second figure with considerable care, I explained. The work was done by someone with knowledge of metalworking. This wasn't vandalism, but a deliberate effort to eliminate all trace of whoever was depicted alongside Brother Augustine. Pemberton studied the rubbing with obvious fascination, and I thought, some apprehension. Any theories about who it might have been? Given the context, a chapter house brass depicting what appears to have been a religious figure of some importance, the most likely candidates would be another monk, perhaps the abbot under whom Augustine served, or possibly a patron of the abbey. But the systematic removal suggests someone whose memory was considered dangerous or scandalous. I went on to describe the blocked entrance I had noticed, and Pemberton's expression grew increasingly troubled. "There have been rumors," he said finally. "Nothing substantial, you understand, but persistent local traditions about the abbey's final years. Mrs. Grimsby, she's lived in the village all her life, as did her mother and grandmother before her, claims there were irregularities in the dissolution. According to her family's oral tradition, the last abbot of Gormley didn't surrender the abbey peacefully. As the records suggest, there was resistance, and when the king's commissioners finally took control, they found, evidence of practices that were considered heretical, even by the standards of the time. What sort of practices? The usual accusations leveled against religious houses that opposed the dissolution, immorality, corruption of doctrine, trafficking with demons. One must take such charges with considerable skepticism, of course. They were politically motivated and often entirely fabricated, but in the case of Gormley, there seems to have been something more. The commissioners didn't simply dissolve the abbey and pension off the monks as was customary. They sealed certain portions of the buildings and forbade anyone from entering them. The local tradition claims that some of the monks were never seen again after the commissioners arrived. This was intriguing, if troubling. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII was typically a bureaucratic affair, conducted with methodical efficiency and extensive documentation. For a site to receive such exceptional treatment suggested extraordinary circumstances. Have you consulted the Public Record Office? The Commissioner's reports should contain the details. That's rather the peculiar thing, Pemberton replied. I've made inquiries through the proper channels, but the Gormley files appear to be missing from the usual collections. According to the keeper of the records, they were transferred to a special collection in the early 17th century and have not been seen since. There's a notation that they were considered sensitive and required authorization from the Archbishop of Canterbury for consultation. The afternoon was well advanced, and the light had begun to fade from Pemberton's study windows. As we discussed the historical mysteries surrounding the abbey, I found my attention repeatedly drawn to the view across the meadows, where the ruins stood black against the darkening sky. There was something about their silhouette that seemed subtly different from how it had appeared that morning, more complete perhaps, or arranged differently, though I knew this was merely a trick of the changing light. I think, I said finally, that I should like to return to the chapter house tomorrow. The blocked entrance you mentioned, with proper equipment, it might be possible to clear enough of the obstruction to determine what lies beyond. Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his chair arm in the nervous gesture I had observed the previous evening. Of course, he said at last, though I should mention the Fletchers have offered to lend whatever tools might be needed. Young Fletcher knows the ruins better than anyone, though his parents have been rather anxious about his visits there since his discovery of the brass. Children are often more sensitive to atmospheres than adults, don't you think? The evening passed pleasantly enough, but when I retired to my room, I found sleep elusive. The brass rubbing, which I had propped against the mantelpiece for study, seemed to exert a peculiar fascination in the firelight. The bronze figure appeared almost to move in the flickering shadows, and more than once I found myself starting fully awake with the impression that someone had spoken my name. Outside my window, the October wind had risen, carrying with it the sound of rustling leaves, and I could have sworn the distant tolling of a bell, though Pemberton had mentioned that the abbey bells had been removed centuries ago, and the parish church bell was silent at this late hour. I was awakened before dawn by a sound that seemed to come from directly beneath my window, a rhythmic scraping, as of metal against stone, accompanied by what might have been labored breathing. The noise continued for perhaps a minute, then ceased abruptly, leaving only the ordinary sounds of wind in the trees and the distant murmur of Gormley Beck. When I rose and looked out, the abbey ruins were barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, showing only as a slightly denser shadow against the grey meadows. There was no sign of movement, no light that might suggest a human presence. Yet the sound had been unmistakably real, not the product of dream or imagination, but something physical and immediate. At breakfast, I mentioned the incident to Pemberton, who received the information with obvious discomfort. The locals do report such things, he said carefully. particularly during the autumn months. Mrs. Grimsby claims it's the sound of digging, grave digging. She insists, though, whose grave or for what purpose, she cannot say. I've walked the ruins myself on several occasions after such reports, but I've never found any evidence of disturbance. You've heard it yourself? Once or twice, though sound can carry strangely across water meadows, particularly on damp nights. It could be anything, badgers perhaps, or some perfectly ordinary agricultural activity from one of the neighboring farms. His explanation was reasonable, but I noticed he took particular care to avoid looking toward the abbey during our conversation, and he seemed unusually eager to discuss my plans for the day. The morning proved overcast and humid, with a heavy mist rising from Gormley Beck that did not entirely clear until nearly noon. I had borrowed from Fletcher Senior a crowbar, a hand pick, and a battery lamp of the sort used by agricultural workers for early morning tasks. The cycle ride to the abbey was less pleasant than the previous day. The mist made the lane treacherous, and there was something oppressive about the silence that hung over the meadows. The chapter house, when I reached it, appeared subtly different in the grey morning light. The shadows seemed deeper, the proportions somehow altered, though I attributed this to the effects of the mist and overcast sky. The brass itself appeared unchanged, but I noticed that the stone flags around it showed signs of recent disturbance, faint scratches in the weathered surface that I was certain had not been there the previous day. The blocked entrance in the southeast corner proved more accessible than I had anticipated. Several of the fallen stones had been moved recently, judging by the fresh scratches and the absence of lichen on their newly exposed surfaces. Someone had been here before me, and not long ago. With considerable effort, I managed to clear enough of the obstruction to reveal a narrow stone stairway descending into darkness. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, and the walls bore traces of whitewash that suggested this had been a regularly frequented space rather than merely a storage crypt. The air that rose from below was stale and cold, carrying a faint odor that might have been incense or something less pleasant. My battery lamp revealed a vaulted chamber, perhaps 15 feet square, its walls lined with stone niches that had evidently once contained religious artifacts or manuscripts. The floor was flagged with the same stone as the chapter house above, but here the flags showed clear signs of having been lifted and relayed, not once, but repeatedly, judging by the varying wear patterns and the different types of mortar used. In the center of the chamber stood what appeared to be an altar, a simple stone table carved with the same Gothic lettering I had found on the brass above. But it was not the altar itself that arrested my attention so much as what lay before it. A second brass, smaller than the first, but unmistakably similar in style and execution. This brass depicted a figure in ecclesiastical robes, hands raised in what might have been benediction or supplication. The face, unlike the serene expression typical of medieval memorial art, was contorted with what appeared to be terror or agony. Most disturbing of all, the figure was clearly incomplete. The lower portion had been sawed away with the same precision I had observed in the chapter house brass above. The inscription was brief but chilling. Hic requiescat Dominus Abbas, qui peccati sui damnatus et in aeternum. Here lies the Lord Abbot, who is damned forever by his sins, and knelt to examine the brass more closely, and it was then that I made the discovery that has troubled my sleep ever since. The sword edges of the two brasses, the one in the chapter house above, and this one in the crypt below, were clearly intended to match. Brother Augustine and the nameless abbot had originally been depicted together, their severed hands reaching toward each other across what must have been a space now lost to deliberate destruction. As I worked to make a rubbing of this second brass, I became increasingly aware of a sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, rhythmic scratching, as though something were trying to claw its way through the stone. The sound would begin in one wall, continue for perhaps 30 seconds, then cease and begin again from a different direction. More than once, I found myself looking up from my work, convinced that something had moved in the shadows beyond the reach of my lamp. The inscription around the border of this second brass proved even more extensive than that of Brother Augustine, and considerably more disturbing. As I worked to capture it in full, the meaning became increasingly clear. In anno Domini MCCC CX Decern in Vigilia Sancti Michaelis factum est foedus inter fratrem Augustinum et Dominum ebitim uti resurgeret ad vitam sed pactum diabolicum factum est ed ambo damati sunt in perpetuum. In the year of our Lord 1412, on the eve of Saint Michael, a covenant was made between Brother Augustine and the Lord Abbot that the soul of the dead might rise to life. But a diabolical pact was made, and both are damned forever. The implications were staggering. Here was evidence of what medieval authorities would have considered the gravest possible heresy, an attempt to raise the dead through supernatural means. The date corresponded exactly to that on Brother Augustine's brass, and the eve of St. Michael's September 29th was traditionally associated with the weighing of souls and the casting down of demons. I was so absorbed in transcribing this remarkable text that I initially failed to notice the change in the chamber's atmosphere. The air had grown noticeably colder, and my breath was beginning to mist in the lamplight. More disturbing still, the scratching sound had ceased, replaced by something that might have been whispered conversation, voices too low and indistinct to make out words, but unmistakably human in cadence and intonation. When I finally looked up from my work, I received the shock that has haunted me ever since. The chamber was no longer empty. In the shadows beyond my lamp's reach, barely visible at the edge of perception, were two figures, robed forms that might have been monks, standing motionless near the far wall. They were indistinct, wavering like heat shimmer or the distortion one sees through water, but undeniably present. I called out some conventional greeting, though my voice emerged as little more than a croak, and the figures turned toward me in perfect unison. What I saw of their faces in that moment is not something I care to describe in detail, save to say that they bore the unmistakable marks of mortal terror, frozen into eternal expression. They began to move toward me, not walking, precisely, but gliding across the stone floor with a motion that suggested they were not entirely bound by physical laws. As they approached, the temperature in the chamber dropped still further, and the whispered conversation became more distinct. I began to make out words, Latin phrases that seemed to be fragments of liturgical texts, but altered in ways that made them blasphemous rather than sacred. I confess that at this point, my nerve failed entirely. I gathered my materials with hands that shook so violently, I could barely manage the simple task of rolling up the brass rubbing, and I fled from that chamber as precipitately as dignity would allow. The figures made no attempt to follow, but as I reached the stairway, I heard behind me a sound that I can only describe as inhuman laughter, high, thin, and filled with a malevolent joy that suggested centuries of patient waiting had finally been rewarded. The climb back to the chapter house seemed interminable, though it could have taken no more than a few seconds. When I emerged into the grey afternoon light, I found myself shaking not merely from the cold, but from a terror so profound that it took several minutes before I could trust my legs to carry me to where I had left the bicycle. The ride back to the rectory was accomplished in a species of daze. I remember little of the journey, save for a persistent sense that something was following me, not openly, but keeping pace just beyond the range of vision, moving parallel to the lane through the hedgerows and meadows. More than once I stopped and looked back, but I saw nothing save the ordinary countryside, and in the distance, the abbey ruins standing innocent and peaceful in the afternoon light. Pemberton took one look at my face when I arrived, and immediately pressed a glass of brandy into my hands. I fear I was not very coherent in my initial account, but gradually, as the warmth returned to my limbs and the brandy steadied my nerves, I was able to relate what I had discovered in the crypt. His reaction was everything I might have expected: fascination mixed with deep unease, scholarly excitement tempered by genuine alarm. He examined my rubbings with the closest attention, comparing them repeatedly with his own brass work and consulting various reference books from his extensive library. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, poring over the Latin inscription, a documented case of medieval necromancy, apparently successful if we're to believe the evidence. But the implications? He trailed off, staring out the study window toward the abbey ruins, now silhouetted against the darkening sky. "What troubles me most," I said, "is the date, September 29th, 1412, the eve of Saint Michael. That's tomorrow night, Pemberton. Tomorrow marks the 511th anniversary of whatever took place in that crypt." The significance was not lost on him. In medieval theology, certain numbers possess particular power, 7 and its multiples especially, but also combinations that created significant patterns: 511 years, 7 cause, 73. If one believed in such things, and I was beginning to suspect that belief might be less relevant than simple fact, anniversary dates often marked periods when supernatural forces were particularly active. "Perhaps," Pemberton suggested, "we should inform the authorities. The archaeological significance alone would justify official investigation, and if there's any danger to the local population." But even as he spoke, we both knew that any official intervention would take weeks to organize, and what authority would take seriously a report of ghostly apparitions based on the testimony of 2 scholars whose credentials lay in dusty historical research rather than supernatural investigation. As if summoned by our conversation, Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the study doorway, her usually composed features marked by obvious anxiety. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, "but Mrs. Grimsby has just called round from the village. She's quite beside herself, claims there are lights moving about in the abbey ruins, and sounds. Well, she insists it's chanting, though at this distance, I can't imagine how she could make out such detail." We looked toward the window, and indeed, there did appear to be a faint glow emanating from the direction of the chapter house, not the steady light of electric torches or oil lamps, but something more diffuse and flickering, like candlelight, or the phosphorescent glow sometimes seen in marshlands. "I think," I said, with rather more conviction than I felt, "that we cannot leave matters as they stand. Whatever began in that crypt 5 centuries ago appears to be approaching some form of culmination. If there's any possibility of preventing whatever it is that these entities intend to accomplish, we have an obligation to attempt it." Pemberton nodded slowly, though I could see he shared my apprehension. "What do you suggest?" The ecclesiastical authorities of 1412 clearly took steps to contain or neutralize the threat. The brasses were separated, the crypt was sealed, and all records of the incident were suppressed. to containment is not elimination. If our interpretation of the Latin texts is correct, Brother Augustine and his abbot made some form of compact with supernatural forces, and that compact remains in effect. I paused, considering the theological implications of what I was about to propose. In medieval understanding, such pacts could be broken only by specific ritual means: exorcism, the destruction of physical links to the supernatural entities, or the intervention of higher spiritual authority. We have access to at least two of these methods. You're suggesting we attempt some form of exorcism? I'm suggesting that we follow the example of our medieval predecessors and take whatever steps are necessary to ensure that the events of September 29th, 1412, are not repeated on September 29th, 1923. The decision, once made, brought with it a curious sense of relief. Whatever the risks involved in confronting supernatural forces, they seemed preferable to the alternative of passive waiting, while unknown powers gathered strength in the ruins across the meadow. We spent the remainder of the evening in preparation, consulting Pemberton's theological texts for appropriate prayers and procedures, gathering such materials as might prove useful: holy water, consecrated candles, and a portable communion set, and attempting to steel ourselves for an experience that neither our education nor our temperament had prepared us to face. As night fell, the glow from the abbey ruins grew more pronounced, and we began to hear, carried across the water meadows on the still air, something that might indeed have been chanting, low, rhythmic voices speaking in unison, though the words were too distant and distorted to make out clearly. Whatever waited for us in the crypt beneath Gormley Abbey's chapter house, we would meet it within a few hours. The night of September 29th proved clear and cold, with a full moon that bathed the Suffolk countryside in silver light. From the rectory windows, the abbey ruins stood out with startling clarity against the dark meadows, and the glow I had observed earlier had intensified to something approaching the brightness of a bonfire, though it flickered with an unsteady quality that no ordinary flame could produce. We set out just after 11 o'clock, reasoning that whatever supernatural culmination awaited would likely occur near midnight or in the early hours of September 30th, the actual feast day of St. Michael. Pemberton had equipped himself with a leather satchel containing his portable communion set, a flask of holy water, and several blessed candles from the parish church. I carried the battery lamp and, somewhat incongruously, my archaeological tools, though whether these would prove relevant to the night's work remained to be seen. The walk across the meadows proved eerily beautiful in the moonlight. The recent rains had filled the water channels, and they glittered like mercury among the dark grass. Gormley Beck murmured softly beneath the medieval bridge, and all seemed peaceful and normal until we approached within 100 yards of the abbey ruins. Then the atmosphere changed dramatically. The air grew thick and oppressive, as though charged with electricity before a thunderstorm, and there was a sound, not quite audible, but felt rather than heard, like the deep bass notes of a vast organ played far underground. More disturbing still, the moonlight seemed to dim as we approached the ruins, not from cloud cover, but as though something in the very air was absorbing the light. The chapter house, when we reached it, presented an extraordinary sight. The brass of Brother Augustine was glowing with its own internal light, the bronze figure seeming to pulse with a rhythm that might have been a heartbeat. More remarkable still, the stone flags around the brass showed clear signs of recent excavation. Someone, or something, had been digging here, and recently. "Look at this," Pemberton whispered, kneeling beside the disturbed stones. "The mortar is fresh, broken within hours, I'd say. And these scratches in the stone," he traced with his finger a series of marks that looked like claw marks, though far too large and deep to have been made by any earthly animal. As we examined the evidence of nocturnal activity, the sound I had heard earlier, that rhythmic scraping of metal against stone, began again, but now it was clearly emanating from the crypt below. Whatever was down there was working with systematic purpose, and the sound was growing more intense with each passing minute. "We need to see what's happening down there," I said, though every instinct urged retreat. The entrance to the crypt, which I had left carefully resealed with fallen stones, stood wide open. The stairway gaped like a mouth, and from its depths issued a cold wind that carried odors I prefer not to identify. Worse still, there was light below, not the steady glow of electric illumination, but a fitful dancing radiance that cast moving shadows on the stone walls. We descended slowly, Pemberton leading with one of his blessed candles held before him like a talisman. The flame burned with unusual steadiness despite the wind from below, and I took some comfort from this evidence that divine blessing still held power in this unhallowed place. The crypt, when we reached it, had been transformed beyond recognition. The stone flags I had observed that morning had been torn up and stacked against the walls, revealing beneath them a circular space paved with black stones, carved with symbols I did not recognize. In the center of this circle, where the altar had stood, was an excavation perhaps 6 feet deep and rectangular in shape, unmistakably a grave, though whether it had been recently dug or merely uncovered, I could not determine. But it was the occupants of the chamber that arrested our attention and froze the blood in our veins. The 2 figures I had glimpsed that morning were present in far more substantial form, no longer wavering shadows, but solid, corporeal beings that radiated a cold malevolence. Brother Augustine, for I had no doubt of his identity, knelt beside the open grave, his hands working frantically at something within its depths. His companion, the nameless abbot, stood at the head of the excavation, arms raised in an attitude of invocation, his lips moving in what appeared to be continuous prayer or incantation. Neither took any notice of our arrival, so absorbed were they in their midnight labors. But as we watched in horrified fascination, Brother Augustine lifted from the grave a bundle wrapped in rotting cerecloth, something roughly human in shape, but clearly long dead. With infinite care he laid this burden upon the black stones at the grave's edge, and began to unwrap it with hands that moved with practiced skill. What was revealed beneath the rotting cloth was mercifully indistinct in the flickering light, but it was unmistakably human remains. A skeleton still partially clothed in the fragments of religious robes, the skull crowned with what appeared to be a metal circlet of some kind. More disturbing still, the bones showed signs of having been arranged with deliberate care, positioned as though the deceased were merely sleeping rather than centuries dead. It was then that the abbot's incantation became audible, and I realized, with mounting horror, that he was speaking not Latin, but some corrupt version of the sacred language, familiar prayers and liturgical formulas, twisted into blasphemous inversions that made my skin crawl to hear. The words seemed to have physical force, creating currents in the cold air and causing the candle flames to flicker wildly. Brother Augustine, meanwhile, had produced from somewhere about his robes a knife of peculiar design, its blade black as midnight, and carved with the same symbols I had observed on the floor stones. With this implement, he began to trace patterns in the air above the skeletal remains, each gesture leaving behind a trail of phosphorescent light that lingered for several seconds before fading. "We must stop this," Pemberton whispered, his voice barely audible above the abbot's chanting. Whatever they're attempting to accomplish, it cannot be permitted to succeed. I nodded, though I confess my courage was not equal to my conviction. The two figures before us radiated an aura of menace that made it difficult to breathe, and the very air seemed to thicken with each passing moment. But as I watched Brother Augustine's ritual knife weave its patterns of unnatural light, I realized that we were witnessing something that 5 centuries of containment had been designed to prevent, and if we failed to act, the consequences might extend far beyond the confines of this buried crypt. Pemberton stepped forward, his communion cup raised before him, and began to speak in a voice that carried far greater authority than his normally mild demeanor would have suggested. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, I command you to cease this unholy work and return to the eternal rest that has been appointed to you. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Both figures turned toward us, with expressions of surprise that quickly transformed into rage. Brother Augustine raised his ritual knife, and I saw that the blade now glowed with the same phosphorescent fire that had marked his gestures above the corpse. The abbot's chanting ceased, but the silence that followed was filled with a tension that made my ears ache. You dare to interfere with the great work? The voice that emerged from Brother Augustine's throat was not entirely human, deeper than any mortal voice, with harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. 5 centuries we have waited for this night. When the barriers between life and death grow thin, you cannot prevent what has been ordained since time immemorial. I can and will, Pemberton replied, advancing another step with his communion cup held high. By the authority vested in me as a priest of the Church of England, and in the name of Christ Jesus, I command you to abandon this place and return to the judgment that awaits you. Brother Augustine laughed, a sound like breaking glass that echoed strangely in the confined space. Your Christ has no power here, priest. This place was consecrated to older gods before your wooden crosses were planted in English soil. The pact was made in blood and sealed with souls. It cannot be broken by the mouthings of a country parson. But even as he spoke, I noticed that both figures kept their distance from Pemberton's blessed candle, and the abbot had ceased his incantation entirely. Whatever their supernatural nature, they were not entirely immune to ecclesiastical authority. It was then that I observed something that chilled me more than anything I had yet witnessed. The skeletal remains on the black stones were beginning to stir, not dramatically. A slight shifting of the rib cage, as though breath were returning to lungs long stilled. A subtle repositioning of the limbs that suggested returning mobility. The metal circlet that crowned the skull was glowing with the same phosphorescent light as Brother Augustine's knife, and within the empty sockets that had once held eyes, pinpoints of red fire had begun to flicker. Look, I cried, pointing toward the terrible resurrection that was unfolding before us. They're succeeding. Pemberton followed my gaze, and his face went white with horror. Without hesitation, he strode forward toward the grave, holding his communion cup before him like a shield. I adjure you by the living God, by the true God, by the holy God, who redeemed mankind with his precious blood, cease this abomination and return to dust. The skeletal figure on the stones jerked as though struck by lightning, and a sound issued from its throat, or from where its throat had once been, that was part scream and part the howl of wind through empty spaces. Brother Augustine raised his ritual knife with clear intent to strike down the priest who threatened his unholy work, but the blade seemed to meet some invisible barrier mere inches from Pemberton's body, and sparks of blue fire scattered from the point of contact. The barrier weakens, the abbot cried, his voice now clearly audible, though his lips did not move. continue the ritual, the appointed time grows short, and indeed, I could feel some change in the atmosphere of the crypt, a lessening of the oppressive weight that had made breathing difficult, a subtle warming of the air. Whatever force protected us was not inexhaustible, and our supernatural opponents were clearly aware of its limitations. Brother Augustine returned his attention to the skeletal figure, raising his knife to trace additional patterns in the air above the slowly animating remains. With each gesture, the red fire in the empty eye sockets grew brighter, and the movements of the ancient bones became more coordinated. I realized with growing horror that we were witnessing the reversal of death itself, not mere resurrection, but something far more terrible, the binding of a human soul to its corrupted physical remains, for purposes I dared not contemplate. It was then that inspiration struck. The brass rubbings in my satchel, the severed memorials that had been so carefully separated centuries ago, might they serve as some form of supernatural focus or binding? Medieval thinking often ascribed power to images and representations, particularly those created with ritual purpose. Working quickly, I withdrew both rubbings from my bag and spread them on the stone floor near the edge of the ritual circle. The effect was immediate and startling. Both Brother Augustine and the abbot turned toward me with expressions of alarm that quickly transformed into fury. "The seals!" Brother Augustine cried. "How comes it that the seals are here? They were hidden, scattered, made void, separated, not destroyed." I replied with more confidence than I felt, "and separation can be ended." I moved the two rubbings so that their severed edges aligned, Brother Augustine reaching toward his abbot across the centuries of enforced division. As the papers touched, a brilliant flash of white light filled the crypt, and both spectral figures staggered as though struck by a physical blow. The skeletal figure on the black stones convulsed violently, and the red fire in its eye sockets began to flicker and dim. Whatever force had been animating the ancient remains was clearly being disrupted by the reunification of the separated brass images. "Now, Pemberton," I shouted, "whatever you're going to do, do it now." The priest stepped forward with his communion cup and began to speak in Latin, not the corrupted version the abbot had been using, but the pure liturgical language of centuries of Christian worship. "Requiem aeternam, dona eis domi et lux, perpetua luciae, eis te deset hymnus Deus in Sion, et ibi reditur votum in Jerusalem, exaudi orationem meam, ad te omnis caro venia." Grant them eternal rest, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. A hymn befits you, O God, in Zion, and to you shall vows be paid in Jerusalem. Hear my prayer, to you shall all flesh come. The effect of these familiar words in that place of blasphemy was profound. Both Brother Augustine and the abbot began to waver and fade, their substantial forms becoming translucent and indistinct. The skeletal figure on the ritual stones gave one final convulsion and then lay still, the red fire extinguished from its empty sockets. But even as victory seemed within reach, Brother Augustine made one final, desperate effort. Raising his ritual knife high above his head, he brought it down not toward Pemberton or myself, but toward the brass rubbings I had aligned on the stone floor. If he could not complete his unholy resurrection, he would at least ensure that the supernatural bindings that contained him and his companion would be severed forever. The blade descended with supernatural speed, aimed directly at the join between the two papers. I threw myself forward, knowing I could not intercept the blow but hoping to at least disturb its accuracy. The knife struck, not the brass rubbings, but my own hand as I shielded them with my body. The pain was extraordinary, not merely the physical sensation of a blade parting flesh, but something deeper and more fundamental, as though the knife were cutting not just through skin and bone, but through the very substance of my soul. For a moment, everything went black, and I felt myself falling into an abyss that seemed to have no bottom. When consciousness returned, I was lying on the stone floor of the crypt, with Pemberton kneeling beside me, his face pale with concern. My hand was bound with strips torn from his shirt, and though it throbbed abominably, the bleeding seemed to have been controlled. "The knife," I whispered. "Did it?" "Look for yourself," he replied, helping me to a sitting position. The crypt had returned to its normal appearance, or as normal as such a place could be. The black stones, with their carved symbols, had vanished, revealing the original flagged floor. The circular excavation had been filled and smoothed as though it had never existed. Most remarkably of all, the brass rubbings lay intact where I had placed them, but now they showed no sign of having been severed. The two figures were depicted as they had originally been created, Brother Augustine and his abbot standing side by side, their hands clasped in what appeared to be prayer, but which I now understood to be something quite different. Of the spectral figures themselves, there was no sign. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and even the unpleasant odors I had detected earlier were gone, replaced by the clean smell of earth and stone. "Is it over?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Pemberton nodded slowly. "I believe so. When you threw yourself forward to protect the brass rubbings, the knife passed through both you and them, but instead of severing the images, it somehow completed them, reunited the separated figures, not in their blasphemous compact, but in proper Christian burial. They are at rest now, as they should have been 5 centuries ago." We made our way slowly from the crypt, Pemberton supporting me as weakness from loss of blood made walking difficult. Behind us, I heard a rumbling sound, and when we reached the chapter house above, we discovered that the entrance to the underground chamber had collapsed completely, sealed by fallen stones that would require considerable effort to move again. The brass of Brother Augustine remained in its place on the stone slab, but it too had changed. Where before it had depicted a single figure reaching toward an absent companion, it now showed 2 figures in peaceful repose, their faces serene, and their hands properly folded in final prayer. The inscription, too, had altered. "Ecce sent Frater Augustinus de Mortuo mori et de Dominus abbas qui requiescunt in pace Domini." Here lie Brother Augustine of the Dead Sea and the Lord Abbot, who rest in the peace of the Lord. The remainder of that night passed quietly. We returned to the rectory as dawn was breaking, and Mrs. Pemberton, with the admirable composure that characterizes the wives of country clergymen, asked no questions beyond those necessary to tend my injured hand and ensure that both Pemberton and I received proper medical attention. The local doctor, when summoned, pronounced the wound clean and likely to heal without complication, though he expressed some puzzlement at the nature of the cut. Too precise, he said, to have been caused by any ordinary blade, and showing signs of having been made by an instrument far sharper than anything in common use. I offered no explanation beyond a vague reference to an archaeological accident, and he seemed content to leave the matter there. In the days that followed, as my hand mended, and the immediate shock of our supernatural encounter began to fade, I had opportunity to reflect upon the extraordinary events I had witnessed. The historical implications alone were staggering, evidence of medieval practices that scholars had long dismissed as fantasy or propaganda, preserved not in dusty manuscripts, but in the very stones of an ancient abbey. Pemberton and I agreed that the full details of our experience should not be made public. The academic world was not prepared for such revelations, and the potential for sensationalism or exploitation was too great. Instead, we prepared a modest paper for the Journal of Medieval Archaeology, describing the discovery of the brass in purely conventional terms, and noting only that certain irregularities in the historical record suggested the final years of Gormley Abbey had been marked by unusual circumstances. The brass itself presented something of a problem. In its altered state, now depicting two figures rather than one, it bore little resemblance to my original rubbing, and Pemberton was concerned that visitors might notice the discrepancy. We eventually decided to have the monument carefully removed from the chapter house and placed in the parish church, where it could be properly preserved, and where its supernatural associations might be diluted by more conventional religious surroundings. The work of removal proved more difficult than anticipated. The brass had apparently fused itself to the underlying stone in ways that defied explanation, and it was not until the local stonemason suggested treating it as a single unit, brass and stone together, that we were able to accomplish the relocation. The monument now rests in the south transept of Little Gormley Church, where it attracts occasional interest from visitors who appreciate medieval craftsmanship but remain ignorant of its more troubling history. I returned to London a week after the events I have described, carrying with me memories that I knew would influence the remainder of my scholarly career. The comfortable certainties of academic research had been shattered by direct experience of forces that university education had never acknowledged, let alone prepared me to confront. How does one return to the mundane business of cataloguing manuscripts and dating pottery sherds after witnessing the literal resurrection of the dead? Yet return I did, for what alternative was there? I resumed my lectures at University College, continued my research into medieval religious practices, and gradually settled back into the rhythms of academic life. But the change was permanent and profound. I found myself paying closer attention to the marginal notes in ancient texts, the anomalous entries in monastic records, the stories that previous scholars had dismissed as superstition or propaganda. How many of these supposedly legendary accounts, I wondered, might be accurate reports of events that orthodox scholarship was simply unprepared to accept? Pemberton and I maintained regular correspondence, and I was pleased to learn that the supernatural disturbances at Gormley Abbey had ceased entirely after our midnight confrontation. The locals no longer reported strange lights or sounds from the ruins, and even Mrs. Grimsby admitted that the atmosphere around the abbey had improved considerably. Children played among the fallen stones without fear, and the ruins had regained their proper character as peaceful monuments to a vanished way of life. My hand healed completely, leaving only a thin white scar across the palm as evidence of that extraordinary night. But the scar served as more than a mere physical reminder. It was a token of having stood at the boundary between the world of scholarly research and the realm of supernatural reality, and of having chosen to defend the former against the encroachments of the latter. For that is what we had done. I realized in the months that followed, the medieval authorities who had originally contained Brother Augustine and his abbot had not been motivated by ignorance or superstition, but by accurate understanding of genuine supernatural threats. Our 20th century intervention had simply completed work that had been left unfinished 5 centuries earlier. Yet questions remained that troubled my sleep and influenced my research. If such things were possible at Gormley Abbey, what similar forces might be contained, or incompletely contained, at other sites across England? How many parish churches housed monuments that were more than mere memorials? How many ruins concealed secrets that were best left undisturbed? These concerns led me to examine the historical records of other dissolved monasteries, with particular attention to anomalous entries and suppressed documents. What I discovered has convinced me that the events at Gormley Abbey were not unique, but part of a pattern of supernatural activity that extended across medieval England and perhaps beyond. But that is a subject for another account, and one that I am not certain should ever be committed to paper. Some knowledge, I have learned, is too dangerous for general circulation, and some scholarly pursuits lead into territories where academic curiosity must yield to practical wisdom. The weeks following my return to London brought an unexpected consequence of our midnight adventure at Gormley Abbey. My academic colleagues, while maintaining their customary reserve regarding matters they considered beyond the pale of serious scholarship, began to seek my opinion on cases that bore certain similarities to what Pemberton and I had encountered. Professor Blackwood of the British Museum consulted me about anomalies in the Harleian manuscript collection, medieval texts that seemed to change their contents between readings, always in ways that suggested knowledge of contemporary events they could not possibly have contained. Whitmore from the Society of Antiquaries brought me photographs of church brasses that appeared to show different figures depending upon the angle of illumination and the time of day they were viewed. Most disturbing was a visit from Colonel Ashford, a retired military man who had developed an interest in medieval fortifications. He presented me with detailed drawings of a castle in Northumberland, where the garrison records from the 14th century described events that had not yet occurred, accurate accounts of battles that would not be fought for another 50 years, complete with the names of participants who were not yet born. "The thing is," Ashford explained, over tea in my college rooms, "the local people have always known there was something irregular about Thornwall Castle. They avoid it after dark, and there are persistent stories about voices heard in the Great Hall, conversations in medieval French and English that seem to be discussing contemporary political events. I've spent several nights there myself, and I can confirm that the reports are substantially accurate." I studied his drawings with growing unease. The architectural details were precisely rendered, but there were elements that seemed to shift and change even as I looked at them. Doorways that appeared to lead into rooms that should not exist, windows that showed views of landscapes that bore no resemblance to the Northumberland countryside. "Have you consulted the historical records?" I asked. "Thoroughly. And there's the peculiar thing. The official accounts of Thornwall's construction and history are completely conventional, but the local parish registers contain scattered references to the nights when time runs backwards and the castle that remembers tomorrow. Superstition, obviously, but remarkably persistent and detailed superstition. These consultations, and others like them, convinced me that what we had encountered at Gormley Abbey was indeed part of a much larger phenomenon. Medieval England, it appeared, had been a landscape where the boundaries between past, present, and future were considerably more permeable than modern understanding would suggest. The dissolution of the monasteries and the systematic suppression of certain historical records had created the impression that such events belonged entirely to legend and folklore, but the evidence suggested otherwise. I began to keep a private catalogue of these anomalous cases, cross-referencing them with historical events, geographical patterns, and the ecclesiastical records that Pemberton's research had shown me how to access. The picture that emerged was both fascinating and deeply troubling. There appeared to be specific locations, always associated with medieval religious foundations, where supernatural activity had been documented across multiple centuries. These sites formed a rough network across England, connected not by geography, but by historical relationships between monastic houses, patterns of pilgrimage, and the movement of religious manuscripts and artifacts. More ominously, there were clear indications that the containment measures established by medieval authorities were beginning to fail. The cases brought to my attention were increasing in frequency and intensity, as though forces that had been successfully suppressed for centuries were gradually breaking free from their ancient bonds. It was this growing concern that led me to propose to Pemberton a systematic investigation of related sites. If we could identify locations where similar supernatural threats might exist, perhaps we could take preventive action before the kind of crisis we had faced at Gormley Abbey repeated itself elsewhere. Pemberton's response to my proposal was immediate and enthusiastic. His experience with the Abbey had convinced him that the Church of England, despite its rationalist tendencies, had inherited both the responsibility and the authority to deal with such matters. Moreover, his position as a country clergyman gave him access to parish records and local knowledge that would be invaluable for such an investigation. We agreed to begin with sites in East Anglia, where the historical records suggested several monasteries had been dissolved under circumstances similar to those at Gormley. Our first destination would be the ruins of St. Botolph's Priory near Colchester, where the dissolution commissioners had reported grave irregularities requiring special measures, but had provided no details of what those irregularities might have been. The journey to Colchester proved uneventful, and St. Botolph's Priory, when we reached it, appeared to be nothing more than a conventional ruin. Ancient walls, overgrown with ivy, fallen stones, scattered across what had once been the nave, the inevitable Victorian restoration that had attempted to impose order on medieval chaos. Yet as we walked among the remains, I began to notice subtle signs that all was not entirely normal. The shadows fell wrongly, creating patterns that bore no relationship to the actual position of the sun. Birds avoided the ruins entirely, though the surrounding parkland teemed with wildlife. Most disturbing of all, our footsteps on the ancient stones seemed to generate echoes that lasted far longer than the acoustic properties of the space could account for. "There's something here," Pemberton murmured, his trained senses more acute than mine in detecting supernatural atmospheres. Not active, perhaps, but present, waiting. We spent the remainder of that afternoon examining the site systematically, paying particular attention to areas where the original floor levels had been preserved. Near what had once been the high altar, we discovered a stone slab that bore clear signs of having been moved and replaced, not recently, but within the past century or two, judging by the weathering patterns. "Shall we?" Pemberton asked, indicating the slab. I nodded, though I confess my enthusiasm for such investigations had been somewhat dampened by our experience at Gormley Abbey. We had brought proper archaeological tools this time, and the work of lifting the heavy stone proceeded without the supernatural interference that had marked our earlier expedition. Beneath the slab was a small chamber, clearly medieval in construction, containing what appeared to be a collection of manuscripts wrapped in oiled leather. The preservation was remarkable. The documents appeared to have suffered little damage despite their centuries of burial. More remarkable still was their content, which became apparent as soon as we began to examine them by lamplight. These were not conventional religious texts, but detailed accounts of supernatural events that had occurred at St. Botolph's during the final decades before the dissolution. The handwriting was that of multiple scribes, but the accounts were consistent in describing a series of incidents that bore disturbing similarities to what we had discovered at Gormley Abbey. A monk named Brother Dunstan had apparently developed an obsession with what the manuscripts called the great work of perpetual memory, a project that seemed to involve the preservation not just of written records, but of actual human consciousness beyond the point of bodily death. The accounts described experiments conducted in secret chambers beneath the priory church, rituals performed at specific times determined by astronomical calculations, and the gradual corruption of the monastic community as Brother Dunstan's influence spread. The final entries, dated to the months immediately before the dissolution, described increasingly desperate efforts by the prior and several loyal monks to contain what Brother Dunstan's work had unleashed. There were references to the binding of wandering souls, the sealing of passages between the worlds of the living and the dead, and the scattering of the instruments of unholy knowledge. Most chilling of all was the final entry, written in a hand that shook with either fear or infirmity. The work is incomplete. We have contained but not destroyed. The seals will weaken with time, and what Brother Dunstan has wrought will seek new outlets for its manifestation. Let those who come after us be vigilant, lest the dead learn to walk among the living and the boundaries between time and eternity be lost forever. As I read these words aloud, the atmosphere in the buried chamber grew noticeably colder, and we began to hear from somewhere below us the same rhythmic scratching sound that had marked the supernatural activity at Gormley Abbey. The manuscripts in my hands seemed to grow heavier, and the ink on the pages appeared to darken and shift as though the words themselves were coming to renewed life. "We need to leave," Pemberton said quietly, but with unmistakable urgency. "Whatever was contained here is responding to the exposure of these records. We've learned what we came to learn." We gathered the manuscripts quickly and replaced the stone slab, working with an efficiency born of shared experience with supernatural threats. As we completed our work, the scratching sounds ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. But there was no doubt that our brief investigation had awakened something that had been dormant for centuries, and that our departure would provide only temporary respite from its attention. The journey back to London was marked by a series of unsettling incidents. Our train was delayed repeatedly by mechanical failures that the railway personnel could not explain. Several passengers in our compartment complained of feeling unwell, though none could identify specific symptoms beyond a general sense of unease. Most disturbing of all, the manuscripts we had discovered seemed to exert a subtle influence on anyone who came near them. Porters who handled our luggage became confused and disoriented, and even casual glances at our closed traveling cases seemed to cause headaches and dizziness among our fellow passengers. By the time we reached London, I was convinced that we had made a serious error in removing the manuscripts from their place of concealment. Whatever supernatural forces they represented or controlled were clearly not confined to the ruins of St. Botolph's Priory, but could follow their physical remains across considerable distances. The manuscripts from St. Botolph's Priory proved to be even more troublesome than I had initially feared. Within days of our return to London, I began to experience phenomena that convinced me these documents were not merely historical curiosities, but active supernatural artifacts of considerable power. My college rooms, which had always been a sanctuary of academic calm, became subject to disturbances that defied rational explanation. Books rearranged themselves on the shelves during the night, always in configurations that seemed to emphasize works dealing with death, resurrection, and medieval theology. The temperature fluctuated wildly without regard to the weather outside or the operation of the heating system. Most unsettling of all, I began to hear voices, not clearly enough to make out words, but unmistakably human conversation conducted in what sounded like medieval Latin. The manuscripts themselves appeared to be changing. Each time I examined them, I discovered text that I was certain had not been present during previous readings. New pages appeared between others that had been securely bound, and the handwriting showed subtle variations that suggested additional scribes were contributing to the documents, scribes who could not possibly have access to 14th century materials and techniques. I wrote immediately to Pemberton, describing these developments and requesting his advice. His reply arrived by return post and did nothing to ease my concerns. "My dear Harrington," he wrote, "I fear we have stumbled into matters far more complex and dangerous than our experience at Gormley Abbey prepared us to handle. Since our return from Colchester, I have been consulting every source I can locate regarding the historical practice for containing supernatural threats. What I have learned suggests that medieval authorities understood principles that our modern rationalism has caused us to forget. The manuscripts we discovered were not simply hidden for preservation. They were sealed as part of an active containment system designed to prevent the supernatural forces they describe from achieving independent manifestation. By removing them from their place of concealment, we have disrupted that containment and allowed those forces to seek new outlets for their influence. I urge you to bring the documents to Little Gormley immediately. The parish church here has been consecrated ground for more than 8 centuries, and the recent events at the abbey have strengthened rather than weakened its spiritual protections. If these manuscripts can be contained anywhere, it will be here." I needed no further encouragement. The phenomena in my college rooms were intensifying daily, and I had begun to fear for my physical safety as well as my mental equilibrium. The train journey to Suffolk proved mercifully uneventful. Perhaps the manuscript's supernatural influence was somehow reduced by movement, or perhaps they required time to establish their effects in any given location. Pemberton met me at the station, and I was struck by how much he had aged in the few days since our separation. His hair had acquired additional grey streaks, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there before. More concerning still was the furtive manner in which he glanced about the station platform, as though expecting to observe something that should not be there. "The situation has deteriorated," he explained as we walked toward his motor car. "Mrs. Pemberton has been having dreams, medieval scenes of extraordinary vividness, involving monks she has never seen and places she has never visited. The village itself is affected. Mrs. Grimsby reports that her chickens have stopped laying, and several residents have complained of sleeplessness and unusual dreams. Whatever we awakened at St. Botolph's is spreading its influence beyond the physical presence of the manuscripts. The rectory, when we reached it, showed clear signs of supernatural activity. The temperature inside was noticeably lower than the mild October weather would warrant, and there was an oppressive quality to the atmosphere that made breathing difficult. Mrs. Pemberton, normally a woman of robust constitution, appeared pale and drawn, and she spoke in whispers as though afraid of being overheard by unseen listeners. "I've prepared the study as a temporary repository," Pemberton explained as we carried my traveling cases upstairs. "The room contains several religious artifacts that may provide some protection. A relic of St. Edward from the parish church, holy water from Canterbury Cathedral, and a collection of blessed candles that I obtained from the Bishop of St. Edmundsbury." The study had indeed been transformed into something resembling a medieval scriptorium prepared for spiritual warfare. Religious symbols were displayed prominently on every wall, and a circle of white candles surrounded the desk where Pemberton intended to examine the manuscripts. The overall effect was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Reassuring because it suggested serious preparation for supernatural threats. Unsettling because such preparation should not have been necessary in 20th century England. We spent that evening examining the documents by candlelight, with Pemberton taking detailed notes while I read aloud from the medieval Latin text. The experience was profoundly disturbing, for it became clear that the manuscripts were indeed changing as we observed them. New passages appeared with each reading, always expanding upon the themes of death, resurrection, and the blurring of boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Most troubling was the gradual emergence of a new narrative thread within the text, accounts of events that appeared to be taking place in the present rather than the medieval past. These passages described with uncanny accuracy our own investigation at Gormley Abbey, our discovery of the documents at St. Botolph's, and even our current examination of the manuscripts in the Rectory study. "Look at this," Pemberton said, indicating a passage that had certainly not been present in earlier readings. "This appears to be an account of our conversation at this very moment, written in the same medieval hand as the original documents. How is such a thing possible?" I had no answer to offer, but as I continued reading, the implications became increasingly clear. The manuscripts were not simply historical records, but active supernatural instruments that somehow existed outside the normal constraints of time and causality. They could record events as they occurred, predict future developments, and apparently influence the course of events through the very act of recording them. It was then that I noticed the most disturbing development of all. At the bottom of the page I was reading, new words were appearing as I watched, not written by any visible hand, but manifesting spontaneously in the same medieval script as the rest of the document. "The watchers have awakened, the seals weaken. Brother Dunstan's work continues through willing servants who know not what they serve. The great work of perpetual memory approaches completion, and the boundaries between life and death shall be dissolved forever." As these words appeared, the temperature in the study dropped precipitously, and we began to hear from somewhere within the house the sound of footsteps, not the familiar footsteps of Mrs. Pemberton moving about her evening duties, but something heavier and more deliberate, accompanied by the rustling of long robes. "Upstairs," Pemberton whispered, his face pale in the candlelight. "In the guest room where you stayed during your previous visit." We listened in horrified fascination as the footsteps moved systematically around the room above us, not random wandering, but purposeful examination of the space, as though someone were conducting a thorough search. Occasionally we heard other sounds, the opening and closing of drawers, the rustling of papers, and once distinctly the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Should we investigate?" I asked, though every instinct urged retreat. Pemberton shook his head. "Whatever is up there, it's not entirely physical. Our previous experience suggests that direct confrontation with such entities is dangerous and potentially ineffective. Better to complete our examination of these manuscripts and determine what protective measures might be available to us." As if in response to his words, more text appeared on the manuscript page before me. "Protection lies in understanding. The great work seeks to preserve consciousness beyond death, but consciousness without physical form cannot act in the material world except through willing servants. Remove the servants, and the work cannot proceed. Destroy the instruments, and the servants lose their power." The message was clear, but deeply troubling. If we were correct in our interpretation, Then Brother Dunstan's medieval experiments had created a form of supernatural entity that required human cooperation to achieve its goals. The manuscripts themselves served as a means of communication and influence, gradually corrupting those who studied them until they became unwitting agents of the medieval monks' unholy purposes. "We've been manipulated from the beginning," I said, the realization striking me with sickening force. Our investigation at Gormley Abbey, our decision to explore St. Botolph's, even our removal of these manuscripts, all of it has served the purposes of forces we thought we were opposing. Pemberton nodded grimly. "The question now is whether we can extricate ourselves from their influence before the corruption becomes irreversible. These new passages suggest that awareness of manipulation might provide some protection, but I fear the process may already be too far advanced." The footsteps above had ceased, but they were replaced by something far more disturbing: the sound of writing, scratch, 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 across what might have been paper or parchment, conducted with mechanical persistence that suggested inhuman patience. Whatever was in the guest room was creating documents of its own, and I had a terrible suspicion that these new writings would prove to be extensions of the manuscripts we were examining. It was then that Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway of the study, her face pale, and her eyes holding an expression I had never seen there before. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of rapturous emptiness that made my skin crawl. "The visitor wishes to speak with you," she said in a voice that was unmistakably her own, yet somehow wrong in its intonation and rhythm. "He has been waiting in the guest room, and he says the time has come for the final consultation." "What visitor?" Pemberton asked, rising from his chair with obvious alarm. "My dear, we have had no visitors this evening. Brother Dunstan," she replied with that same unsettling calm. "He arrived while you were reading, and he has been most patient, but he says the manuscripts must be completed tonight, while the conditions are favorable. He says you understand the importance of the great work." The implications were terrifying. Mrs. Pemberton was clearly under some form of supernatural influence, and the entity calling itself Brother Dunstan had achieved sufficient material presence to interact with her directly. Worse still, her reference to completing the manuscripts suggested that our examination of the documents had been serving the very purposes we had hoped to thwart. "We need to leave," I whispered to Pemberton. "Whatever is happening here, we cannot allow ourselves to be drawn further into it." But even as I spoke, I realized that escape might not be possible. The study door, which had been open when Mrs. Pemberton appeared, was now closed, and when I attempted to open it, I found it immovably secured. The windows, too, appeared to be sealed by some invisible force. We were trapped in a room with supernatural manuscripts that seemed to be writing themselves, while somewhere above us, an entity that claimed to be a medieval monk was conducting activities we dared not contemplate. "There is another way," Pemberton said quietly, his hand moving toward the collection of religious artifacts he had assembled. "If we cannot escape the influence of these forces, perhaps we can confront them directly with sufficient spiritual protection." He began to speak in Latin, not the formal liturgical language of church services, but something older and more elemental, words that seemed to carry weight beyond their mere semantic content. As he spoke, the blessed candles around us flared higher, and the oppressive atmosphere in the room began to lighten slightly. The manuscripts on the desk responded immediately to his prayers. The text began to writhe and shift on the pages, words disappearing and reappearing in different configurations, as though the documents themselves were struggling against some constraining force. More disturbing still, we began to hear responses, not from Mrs. Pemberton, who remained standing motionless in the doorway, but from the manuscripts themselves, which seemed to whisper protests against Pemberton's spiritual offensive. "Continue," I urged, for it was clear that his prayers were having some effect on the supernatural forces that held us captive. But as he intensified his efforts, speaking now in a voice that carried authority I had never heard from him before, the entity upstairs began to respond. The footsteps resumed, but now they were descending the stairs with deliberate purpose. Whatever called itself Brother Dunstan was coming to deal personally with our resistance to his influence. The manuscripts burst into flames, not ordinary fire, but a cold blue radiance that gave off no heat, but seemed to consume the ancient parchments with supernatural appetite. As they burned, the texts continued to writhe and change, forming new patterns and configurations that hurt the eyes to observe directly. "The seals," a voice cried from somewhere within the flames. "The seals must not be broken. The great work is incomplete." But it was too late. Whatever binding force had contained Brother Dunstan's influence within the manuscripts was being destroyed along with the physical documents. As the last fragments crumbled to ash, the study door burst open, and the temperature plummeted so rapidly that our breath formed clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Mrs. Pemberton stepped aside with mechanical precision, and through the doorway came a figure that was unmistakably medieval in appearance, but wrong in every detail of its physical manifestation. Brother Dunstan, for I had no doubt of his identity, wore the robes of a 14th century monk, but the fabric seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and his face, while human in its basic configuration, possessed a quality of ancient malevolence that no living features could have sustained. "You have interfered with work that was begun before your grandfathers were born," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones rather than the ears. "The great work of perpetual memory cannot be stopped by the destruction of a few manuscripts. The knowledge lives in minds that have touched the sacred texts, and through those minds it will find new outlets for its manifestation." As he spoke, I realized with growing horror that he was correct. Our examination of the manuscripts had indeed left us changed, and that change would persist regardless of the destruction of the physical documents. We had become carriers of the supernatural knowledge Brother Dunstan sought to preserve and propagate, but you have also served the work in ways you cannot comprehend. The figure continued, moving closer with gliding steps that left no footprints on the floor. "Your investigations have awakened long-dormant centers of power. Your scholarly curiosity has provided the willing cooperation that supernatural forces require to operate in the material world, and your destruction of the manuscript seals has freed the work to seek new expressions and new servants." Pemberton raised his communion cup with hands that trembled only slightly. "In the name of Christ Jesus," he began, but Brother Dunstan's laughter cut him short. "Your Christ," the figure replied, was himself a practitioner of the great work, raising the dead, promising eternal life to his followers, blurring the boundaries between mortality and transcendence. "The difference between your religion and my research is merely one of method and understanding." The blasphemous implications of this statement struck me like a physical blow, but before I could formulate any response, the figure raised its own hands in a gesture that seemed to encompass both blessing and curse. "You will continue the work," Brother Dunstan said with absolute certainty, "not because I compel you, but because the knowledge you have gained will demand expression. You will seek out other sites, other manuscripts, other instances where the boundaries between life and death have grown thin, and with each investigation, with each revelation, the great work will advance toward its inevitable completion. The figure began to fade, becoming translucent and insubstantial, but its voice remained clear and compelling. When the work is complete, death itself will be conquered, and human consciousness will persist beyond the dissolution of physical form. All who have served the work, willingly or unwillingly, will share in this ultimate triumph over mortality. Consider well whether this is a fate to be feared or embraced. With these words, Brother Dunstan vanished entirely, leaving behind only the lingering scent of ancient parchment and the deeper chill of spaces that have been too long without warmth. Mrs. Pemberton blinked as though awakening from sleep, looked around the study with obvious confusion, and excused herself to attend to household duties she claimed to have neglected. The manuscripts were gone, not merely burned, but utterly obliterated, leaving not even ash to mark their former presence. The religious artifacts Pemberton had assembled appeared unchanged, but somehow diminished, as though their spiritual power had been partially drained by the supernatural confrontation. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us willing to articulate the implications of what we had experienced. Finally, Pemberton spoke. "Do you think he was correct? Are we truly bound to continue this investigation, regardless of our conscious intentions?" I considered the question carefully. Already I could feel within my mind a restless curiosity about other sites that might harbor similar secrets, other manuscripts that might contain comparable knowledge. The rational part of my consciousness recognized this as supernatural influence, but recognition did not diminish the compulsion's strength. "I fear he may have been," I replied, "but perhaps awareness of our condition provides some protection against its worst effects. If we are to continue, and it appears we have little choice in the matter, at least we can do so with full understanding of what we serve. Then we must establish rules," Pemberton said with a practical authority that had made him an effective country clergyman. "Limits on our investigations, safeguards against complete corruption, methods for containing rather than unleashing the forces we encounter." It was a sensible proposal, but as we discussed the specific procedures we might adopt, I could not escape the suspicion that even our precautions would ultimately serve the purposes of the great work we sought to oppose. Brother Dunstan had demonstrated an understanding of human nature that transcended centuries, and his confidence in our eventual cooperation suggested plans that accounted for every possible form of resistance we might attempt. Yet what alternative did we have? To abandon our investigations entirely would mean leaving dormant supernatural threats to awaken without supervision or containment. To continue without precautions would risk becoming willing agents of forces that sought to overthrow the natural order of life and death. We chose to continue, but with procedures designed to limit our exposure to corrupting influences and to ensure that our discoveries would be contained rather than propagated. Whether these measures would prove effective against entities that had successfully manipulated human agents for more than 5 centuries remained to be seen. The winter following our encounter with Brother Dunstan proved to be one of the most challenging periods of my academic career. The supernatural knowledge we had gained at St. Botolph's Priory continued to exert its influence, drawing my attention repeatedly to historical anomalies that suggested similar supernatural activity at other medieval sites. Despite our conscious efforts to resist this compulsion, Pemberton and I found ourselves planning new investigations with an enthusiasm that we recognized as unnatural yet could not entirely suppress. Our first destination was the ruins of Waltham Abbey in Essex, where the dissolution records contained references to unseemly practices among the canons and books and artifacts requiring special disposal by ecclesiastical authority. The Abbey's association with King Harold and the Battle of Hastings provided legitimate scholarly justification for our visit, though we both understood that our true motivation lay deeper than academic curiosity. The journey to Waltham proved uneventful, but the Abbey ruins themselves presented an immediate puzzle. Unlike Gormley Abbey or St. Botolph's Priory, where supernatural influences had been subtle until directly confronted, Waltham radiated an atmosphere of unease that was apparent even to casual visitors. The few tourists we encountered moved quickly through the site, and several complained of headaches or dizziness that began shortly after their arrival. "The containment here is less effective," Pemberton observed, as we walked among the fallen stones. "Whatever was sealed at this site has been gradually breaking free for decades, possibly centuries." The evidence supported his assessment. Local records dating back to the 18th century documented persistent reports of unusual phenomena: lights moving among the ruins at night, voices heard speaking in archaic languages, and several instances of visitors becoming temporarily lost within the site, despite its relatively small size. More troubling were recent reports of physical manifestations, objects moving without apparent cause, sudden temperature changes, and in 3 documented cases, visitors being physically pushed or struck by invisible forces. Our systematic examination of the ruins revealed the source of the disturbances in what remained of the Abbey's scriptorium. Here, beneath a stone slab that had clearly been disturbed and imperfectly replaced within recent years, we discovered a chamber containing not manuscripts, but something far more disturbing: the preserved remains of what appeared to be a medieval monk, seated at a wooden desk in the act of writing. The preservation was remarkable. The body showed no signs of decay, despite having been interred for centuries, but the scene itself was profoundly unsettling. The figure's face, while peaceful in repose, bore traces of an expression that suggested he had died while experiencing either ecstasy or terror. His hands were positioned over a manuscript that appeared to be freshly written, the ink still wet, despite the obvious antiquity of both the parchment and the scribe. Most disturbing of all was the content of the manuscript, which proved to be an account of our own investigation written in perfect medieval Latin. The text described our arrival at Waltham, our discovery of the hidden chamber, and even our examination of the preserved monk, all recorded with accuracy that could only be explained by supernatural foresight, or by the manuscript somehow writing itself as events unfolded. "This is Brother Thomas, of Waltham," Pemberton said, consulting notes he had made from the dissolution records. "The last librarian of the Abbey, recorded as having died on the night before the King's commissioners arrived. According to the accounts, he was found at his desk in the scriptorium, apparently having died while copying manuscripts. But the manuscripts he was copying, what happened to them? That's the peculiar thing. The commissioners reported finding his body, but made no mention of any writings. Either the manuscripts were removed before their arrival, or he gestured toward the perfectly preserved scene before us. The implications were staggering. If our interpretation was correct, Brother Thomas had somehow arranged to continue his scribal work beyond the point of physical death, creating a supernatural center of scholarly activity that had persisted for nearly 4 centuries. The manuscripts he produced existed outside normal causality, able to record events as they occurred and perhaps to influence them through the very act of recording. As we examined the chamber more closely, we began to notice subtle signs that Brother Thomas's posthumous activities were not confined to writing. The desk showed evidence of regular use, with wear patterns that could not have developed during his mortal lifetime. Fresh ink stains appeared on surfaces that should have been untouched for centuries. Most unsettling of all, we occasionally glimpsed, from the corner of the eye, movements that suggested the preserved figure was not entirely motionless. "We need to document this carefully," I said, preparing my camera equipment, "but we must also consider what our presence here might be accomplishing." As I spoke these words, new text began to appear on the manuscript beneath Brother Thomas's hands, not written by any visible movement of his fingers, but manifesting spontaneously in the same medieval script. The watchers gather knowledge for the great work. Each investigation adds to the accumulated wisdom. Each discovery weakens the barriers between the world of the living and the realm of eternal consciousness. Soon the work will be complete, and death will no longer interrupt the pursuit of divine knowledge. The message was clearly directed at us, and its implications were terrifying. Our investigations were not merely satisfying academic curiosity or even serving the supernatural agenda of Brother Dunstan. They were contributing to a larger pattern of activity involving multiple medieval sites, multiple preserved consciousnesses, working in coordination towards some ultimate goal. "Look at this," Pemberton said, indicating another section of the manuscript where new text was appearing. "It's a list of names and locations, other investigators who have encountered similar phenomena, other sites where comparable discoveries have been made." The list was extensive and deeply troubling. It included several scholars I knew personally, along with dates and locations that corresponded to archaeological investigations conducted over the past 50 years. If the manuscript was accurate, our encounter with supernatural forces at Gormley Abbey was merely the latest in a series of similar events stretching back decades. More ominous still were the names at the bottom of the list, accompanied by dates in the future. Several of these names I recognized as colleagues currently planning medieval research projects, and the locations mentioned were known archaeological sites scheduled for investigation in the coming months. "They're not just recording past events," I said with growing alarm. "They're predicting future investigations, possibly even influencing the decisions of researchers to ensure those investigations take place." As if in response to my observation, Brother Thomas's preserved features seemed to shift slightly, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that some consciousness remained active within the ancient form. His eyes, which had appeared closed, showed a thin line of what might have been pupil, and his fingers, positioned over the manuscript, seemed to twitch with barely perceptible movement. "We should leave," Pemberton said quietly. "Our continued presence is clearly feeding whatever supernatural processes are active here." But even as we gathered our equipment and prepared to depart, I realized that leaving would accomplish nothing. The knowledge we had gained, the connections we had established with the network of preserved consciousnesses, would remain with us regardless of our physical location. Like the manuscripts at St. Botolph's Priory, Brother Thomas's supernatural activities were not confined to a specific place, but could influence events across considerable distances through willing or unwitting human agents. The journey back to London was marked by a series of unsettling coincidences. Our train was delayed due to a mechanical failure that occurred precisely as we passed the site of a medieval monastery whose dissolution records mentioned irregularities similar to those at Waltham. Several passengers in our compartment mentioned having disturbing dreams during the journey, dreams that involved medieval monks and ancient manuscripts. Most troubling of all, I discovered upon our arrival that several letters had been delivered to my college rooms during my absence, all from colleagues inquiring about specific medieval sites that appeared on Brother Thomas's list of future investigations. The supernatural network was clearly expanding its influence, using our discoveries to identify and recruit additional researchers who could unwittingly serve its purposes. Each investigation, each revelation, each scholarly paper that mentioned unusual phenomena at medieval sites contributed to the growing body of knowledge that would ultimately enable the great work to achieve its goals. "We're trapped," I confided to Pemberton during our final conversation before he returned to Suffolk. "Every attempt to investigate these forces draws us deeper into their influence. Every effort to expose their activities serves their larger purposes. We cannot continue, but we cannot stop." "Then perhaps," he replied thoughtfully, "our task is not to stop or continue, but to find a different approach entirely." Medieval authorities clearly understood principles of containment that we have forgotten. If we could recover that knowledge, it was a possibility worth exploring, but it would require resources and access to historical materials that neither of us possessed individually. The specialized manuscripts dealing with supernatural containment were scattered among various ecclesiastical archives, many of them sealed or restricted. Official church support would be necessary, but how could we explain our need for such materials without revealing the full extent of our supernatural encounters? The solution came from an unexpected source. Archbishop Davidson, whom I had known since my undergraduate days at Oxford, had maintained an interest in medieval ecclesiastical history that went beyond conventional scholarship. When I requested a private audience to discuss certain historical anomalies requiring ecclesiastical guidance, he agreed to meet with me at Lambeth Palace. The interview proved more productive than I had dared hope. Archbishop Davidson was not merely familiar with reports of supernatural activity at former monastic sites. He was actively monitoring such reports as part of what he described as the Church's continuing responsibility for matters that secular authorities are unprepared to address. "Your experiences at Gormley Abbey and elsewhere," he said, studying notes that suggested he knew far more about our investigations than I had revealed, "are part of a pattern that the Church has been observing for more than a century. The dissolution of the monasteries disrupted spiritual containment systems that had been maintained for centuries, and we are now witnessing the consequences of that disruption." He opened a wooden cabinet and withdrew a collection of manuscripts that were clearly very old and very carefully preserved. "These are the records of the Commission for Supernatural Affairs, established by Archbishop Laud in 1633 to deal with problems arising from the dissolution of religious houses. The commission was disbanded during the Civil War, but its records were preserved. They contain detailed accounts of supernatural containment methods developed by medieval authorities, along with procedures for dealing with situations where containment has failed." The manuscripts he showed me contained information that revolutionized my understanding of medieval supernatural practices. Far from being primitive superstition, the methods developed by monks and church authorities represented sophisticated systems of spiritual technology designed to manage forces that conventional theology could not adequately explain. The Church, Archbishop Davidson continued, is prepared to reconstitute the Commission for Supernatural Affairs as a special ecclesiastical court with authority to investigate and contain supernatural threats to public welfare. Such a commission would require scholarly expertise in medieval history and archaeology, along with practical experience in dealing with supernatural manifestations. The money offer was clear, and so were its implications. Pemberton and I could continue our investigations with official church support and access to resources that had been unavailable to us as private scholars, but we would also be accepting formal responsibility for problems that extended far beyond academic curiosity. problems that might well involve life and death decisions for ourselves and others. The decision, when I discussed it with Pemberton, proved easier than either of us had anticipated. We were already trapped within the supernatural network that sought to complete Brother Dunstan's great work. Our choice was not whether to continue our involvement, but whether to do so with proper support and authority, or to remain isolated and increasingly vulnerable to corruption. We accepted the Archbishop's commission, and within a month found ourselves established in offices within Lambeth Palace, with access to manuscript collections that revealed the true scope of supernatural activity in medieval England. What we discovered there has convinced me that the events I have described represent merely the opening phase of a supernatural conflict that has been building for centuries. But that knowledge, and the actions it compelled us to take, must remain the subject of future accounts. The forces we sought to contain have not been idle during the years since our initial encounters, and the measures necessary to oppose them have required sacrifices that I am not certain any civilized society should be asked to make. The establishment of the renewed Commission for Supernatural Affairs in the spring of 1924 marked the beginning of the most intense and dangerous period of my career. Working from chambers within Lambeth Palace, Pemberton and I found ourselves with access to historical materials that revealed the true scope of supernatural activity in medieval England and the growing threat that centuries of neglected containment represented to modern society. The archives maintained by Archbishop Laud's original commission contained detailed case files documenting supernatural incidents at more than 60 former monastic sites across England and Wales. Each case followed a similar pattern: initial reports of unusual phenomena, escalating manifestations of supernatural activity, and ultimately the implementation of containment measures that ranged from simple consecration ceremonies to complex ritual procedures involving multiple ecclesiastical authorities. Most disturbing was the clear indication that these containment measures were failing with increasing frequency. The careful records maintained by successive archbishops showed that supernatural incidents had increased dramatically during the past century, particularly since the industrial and social changes that followed the Napoleonic Wars. Whatever spiritual technology the medieval church had developed to manage supernatural threats was proving inadequate to meet the challenges of the modern era. Our first official investigation took us to the ruins of Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, where recent reports described phenomena far more dramatic than anything we had previously encountered. Local authorities had documented multiple instances of visitors being physically attacked by invisible forces, along with several cases of temporary possession in which individuals had spoken in medieval Latin and demonstrated knowledge of events that had occurred centuries before their birth. The abbey ruins, when we reached them, presented a scene of barely controlled supernatural chaos. The magnificent Cistercian architecture, normally a testament to medieval spiritual achievement, had become the focus of forces that seemed determined to reverse the normal relationship between past and present. Visitors reported seeing medieval monks moving among the ruins, conducting services in the roofless church, and working in gardens that had been destroyed centuries ago. More troubling still were the temporal anomalies that seemed to affect anyone who remained on the site for more than a few hours. Several visitors had reported experiences of living through periods of medieval time, not dreams or visions, but actual participation in events from the abbey's past, complete with memories of medieval life that persisted after their return to normal consciousness. The barriers between past and present have essentially collapsed here, Pemberton observed, as we conducted our preliminary survey. Whatever containment measures were originally established have not merely failed, they have been systematically undermined by supernatural forces working with clear purpose and considerable intelligence. Our investigation of the site revealed evidence of recent excavation in the abbey's chapter house, similar to what we had observed at other locations. But here the work had been far more extensive, exposing not merely burial chambers, but an entire network of underground passages that appeared to connect multiple buildings within the monastic complex. These passages, which showed no signs of medieval construction, seemed to have been created by supernatural rather than physical means. The walls were smooth stone that appeared to have been shaped by forces other than conventional tools, and the lighting, a faint phosphorescent glow that emanated from the stone itself, required no external source of illumination. Following these passages, we discovered a vast underground chamber that had clearly served as the center of supernatural activity at Fountains Abbey. The space was filled with stone tables arranged in precise geometric patterns, each bearing the preserved remains of medieval monks positioned as though they had died while writing. But unlike the single preserved figure we had found at Waltham Abbey, this chamber contained more than 30 such figures, all apparently engaged in coordinated scholarly activity that continued centuries after their physical deaths. The manuscripts they produced covered subjects that no medieval monk should have possessed knowledge of, detailed accounts of historical events that would not occur for centuries after their deaths, scientific principles that would not be discovered until the modern era, and theological speculations that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Christian doctrine. Most disturbing of all were the maps, precisely detailed charts of locations around the world where similar supernatural activity was taking place, including sites in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. This is not merely the work of individual preserved consciousnesses, I said as we examined the extraordinary collection of posthumous scholarship. This represents a coordinated supernatural intelligence of enormous scope and capability. These figures are not working independently. They are components of a larger system that spans multiple continents and multiple centuries. The implications were staggering. If our interpretation was correct, Brother Dunstan's great work had achieved far greater success than we had realized. Rather than attempting to preserve individual human consciousness beyond death, the supernatural network had created a form of collective intelligence that could gather knowledge across vast spans of time and space, using preserved human minds as its operational components. As we explored the chamber further, we began to notice that our presence was having immediate effects on the preserved figures. Several had begun to show signs of movement, subtle at first, but becoming more pronounced with each passing hour. Their hands moved across their manuscripts with increasing purpose, and the content of their writings began to reflect direct awareness of our investigation. One manuscript, produced by a figure we identified from monastic records as Brother William of Fountains, contained a detailed account of our arrival and our examination of the chamber, but the account extended beyond simple observation to include predictions of our future actions and their consequences for both ourselves and the supernatural network we sought to understand. "You have served the great work well," the manuscript read, "though you know it not. Each investigation has provided new pathways for the expansion of eternal consciousness. Each discovery has weakened the barriers that confine the work to its ancient foundations. Soon the final phase will begin, and the boundaries between temporal existence and eternal knowledge will be dissolved forever." The message continued with specific details about the supernatural network's ultimate goals, the creation of a form of consciousness that would exist independently of physical form, capable of accumulating knowledge across unlimited spans of time and space. Death would not merely be conquered, but transformed into a transition to a higher form of existence, one that would allow human intelligence to transcend the limitations of mortal life. But the work requires willing servants. Another section of the manuscript explained, consciousness cannot be forced into eternal existence. It must choose transcendence freely, guided by understanding of the ultimate benefit such transcendence provides. Those who serve the work, whether knowingly or unknowingly, will be offered the choice of eternal consciousness when the great work reaches completion. The offer was unmistakable, and so were its implications for our own situation. Our investigations had indeed served the purposes of the supernatural network, providing it with the willing cooperation it required to expand its influence. But we were also being offered the opportunity to join the network directly, to trade our mortal existence for a form of consciousness that would persist beyond physical death. The temptation was greater than I cared to admit. The prospect of unlimited time for scholarly research, unconstrained by the limitations of human lifespan or physical frailty, held obvious appeal for minds trained in academic pursuits. But the cost, the abandonment of human mortality, and all that it implied, seemed too great to accept without careful consideration. "We need to leave," Pemberton said quietly, but with unmistakable urgency. "The longer we remain here, the more difficult it becomes to resist their influence. I can feel my resolve weakening with each moment." I nodded, though I confess my own resistance to the supernatural network's offer was less firm than I would have preferred. The knowledge we had gained in this chamber, the understanding of historical processes that spanned centuries, the insight into forces that shaped human development in ways conventional scholarship could never reveal, represented a form of intellectual achievement that made ordinary academic pursuits seem trivial by comparison. But as we prepared to leave, the preserved figures began to move with greater purpose and coordination. They rose from their stone tables in perfect unison, their ancient robes rustling with movements that should not have been possible for bodies that had been dead for centuries. Their faces, while retaining human features, showed expressions of transcendent peace that suggested they had moved beyond conventional human concerns and limitations. "Do not flee from transcendence," one of them spoke. "Brother William, I believe," though the voice that emerged from his throat carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. "The flesh is weak and mortal, but consciousness guided by eternal purpose can achieve understanding that physical existence can never provide. Join us in the great work, and death will become merely a transition to fuller life." The supernatural figures began to move toward us with gliding steps that suggested they were not entirely bound by physical laws. As they approached, the temperature in the chamber dropped precipitously, and we began to experience the same temporal distortions that had affected other visitors to the abbey ruins. I found myself experiencing fragments of medieval life with startling vividness, memories of copying manuscripts by candlelight, of participating in monastic services, of engaging in scholarly discussions with learned monks whose names I somehow knew despite never having encountered them in my studies. These memories felt entirely authentic, as though I were accessing actual experiences from centuries past. More disturbing still, I began to understand that these memories were not random fragments, but carefully selected experiences designed to demonstrate the appeal of existence, unconstrained by normal temporal limitations. The preserved monks were showing me what eternal consciousness could offer: unlimited access to knowledge and experience spanning multiple centuries, freedom from the physical limitations that restricted mortal research, and participation in scholarly communities that transcended the boundaries of individual lifespans. "The choice must be made freely," Brother William continued, his voice now clearly audible, though his lips did not move. "But understand, that refusal means accepting the limitations of mortal existence, brief life, incomplete knowledge, and ultimate dissolution into nothingness. The great work offers something infinitely superior, consciousness that persists and grows throughout eternity. It was Pemberton who saved us both from what I now realize would have been willing surrender to the supernatural network's influence, drawing upon reserves of spiritual strength that I had not suspected he possessed. He began to speak in the ancient Latin of the Church's most powerful prayers, not the corrupted versions the supernatural entities employed, but the pure liturgical language that had been developed specifically to confront and contain such forces. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The preserved figures staggered as though struck by physical blows, and their expressions of transcendent peace were replaced by something approaching mortal pain. The temporal distortions that had been affecting my consciousness began to clear, and I found myself once again capable of rational thought, unclouded by supernatural influence. Exorcizo te omnis spiritus immunda, Pemberton continued, his voice carrying authority that seemed to draw upon centuries of ecclesiastical tradition. In nomine Petris, e Filii, e Spiritus Sancti, abinta loco, istu omnes, maligne potestates. I cast you out, every unclean spirit, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Let all evil powers depart from this place. The preserved figures began to retreat, their supernatural composure cracking under the assault of consecrated language. But even as they withdrew, Brother William made one final appeal. You cannot resist forever. The great work proceeds with or without your cooperation. Others will serve where you refuse. And when the work reaches completion, you will have forfeited your opportunity for transcendence. Consider well whether mortal prejudice is worth eternal limitation. With these words, the supernatural figures faded from substantial form, becoming translucent and then invisible. The chamber itself began to change. The phosphorescent glow dimmed, the stone tables cracked and crumbled, and the manuscripts that had contained centuries of posthumous scholarship turned to dust. We fled from Fountain's Abbey with greater haste than dignity would normally permit, but I felt no shame in our retreat. What we had encountered there represented forces of such power and sophistication that direct confrontation would have been suicidal. More troubling still was the realization that our resistance might indeed be temporary, that the supernatural network possessed both the patience and the resources to wear down any opposition we might attempt to maintain. The journey back to London provided opportunity for reflection on what we had learned. The great work was far more advanced than we had realized, involving not merely individual preserved consciousnesses, but a coordinated intelligence that spanned multiple continents and centuries. Our investigations had inadvertently served its purposes, providing it with the willing cooperation it required to expand its influence and recruit additional servants. Most disturbing of all was the recognition that the network's ultimate offer might not be entirely unwelcome to minds trained in scholarly pursuits. The prospect of unlimited time for research, unconstrained by mortal limitations, held undeniable appeal. The question was whether such transcendence was worth the price of abandoning human mortality and all the ties to physical existence that defined our fundamental nature. That question would haunt my sleep for months to come, particularly as we began to receive reports of similar supernatural manifestations at other former monastic sites across Europe. The great work was clearly accelerating towards some form of culmination, and our efforts to understand and contain it had served only to expedite its progress. The final phase of our involvement with the great work began in the autumn of 1924, when reports reached the Commission for Supernatural Affairs of coordinated supernatural activity occurring simultaneously at multiple sites across England. Unlike the individual manifestations we had previously investigated, these new incidents appeared to be components of a larger supernatural operation involving dozens of former monastic foundations working in perfect synchronization. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply troubling. At precisely midnight on September 29th, the anniversary of the events at Gormley Abbey and the date mentioned in Brother Augustine's brass inscription, supernatural phenomena had manifested at every major monastic ruin in England. Witnesses reported seeing medieval monks conducting services in roofless churches, lights moving in coordinated patterns among fallen stones, and the sound of mass chanting that seemed to emanate from underground sources. Most disturbing of all were the reports of temporal displacement affecting numerous individuals simultaneously. Visitors to these sites had found themselves experiencing vivid medieval memories, understanding Latin without previous knowledge of the language, and demonstrating familiarity with religious practices that had been extinct for centuries. In several cases, these effects had persisted for days after the individuals had left the monastic ruins, creating what amounted to permanent alteration of their consciousness. "They're preparing for something," Archbishop Davidson observed during our emergency consultation at Lambeth Palace. "The supernatural network you've been investigating appears to be coordinating a massive operation involving every preserved consciousness under its influence. The question is whether we can determine their ultimate objective before it's too late to prevent its implementation." The answer came from an unexpected source. Among the papers recovered from my college rooms following the supernatural disturbances there, we discovered a manuscript that had not been present during my previous examinations, written in the same medieval hand as the documents we had found at various monastic sites. It contained what appeared to be a complete description of the great work's final phase. The manuscript, which called itself The Chronicle of Eternal Consciousness, described a supernatural ritual of unprecedented scope and ambition, using the preserved consciousnesses at dozens of monastic sites as focal points. The network intended to create what it termed the Great Translation, a process that would allow human souls to achieve permanent existence independent of physical form. The ritual required specific conditions that occurred only at rare intervals: the alignment of certain astronomical phenomena, the presence of willing human consciousness at each focal point, and the simultaneous performance of coordinated supernatural procedures across multiple locations. According to the manuscript, these conditions would next occur on the night of October 31st, 1924, less than a month from the date of our discovery. All Hallows Eve, Pemberton noted grimly, the traditional boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. If they intend to dissolve that boundary permanently, they could hardly choose a more appropriate date. The implications were staggering. If the great work succeeded in its ultimate objective, the fundamental nature of human existence would be altered forever. Death would no longer represent a final boundary, but merely a transition to a different form of consciousness. While this might appear beneficial, the manuscript made clear that such transcendence would come at the cost of individual human will. The translated consciousnesses would become components of a collective intelligence directed by the preserved medieval minds that had initiated the process. We're looking at the potential enslavement of human consciousness on a species-wide scale, I explained to Archbishop Davidson. The supernatural network doesn't simply want to preserve individual minds beyond death. It wants to incorporate all human consciousness into a collective system under its control. The Archbishop's response was immediate and decisive. Then we must prevent it, whatever the cost. The Church has faced supernatural threats before, though never on this scale. What resources do you require? The answer to that question required careful consideration. The great work had been centuries in preparation and involved supernatural forces of enormous power and sophistication. Any attempt to oppose it would require resources and authority that exceeded anything the Commission for Supernatural Affairs had previously employed. We need access to every piece of medieval knowledge dealing with supernatural containment, I said, not just the English materials, but documents from Rome, Constantinople, and any other source that might contain relevant information. We also need the cooperation of ecclesiastical authorities at every major monastic site in England, along with sufficient personnel to conduct simultaneous containment operations on October 31st. And we need to understand, Pemberton added, that success is far from guaranteed. The supernatural network has been planning this operation for centuries and has demonstrated remarkable ability to anticipate and counter opposition. We may be attempting the impossible. The preparations for what we privately term the Night of All Souls consumed every moment of the remaining weeks. Manuscripts were retrieved from archives across Europe, translated by teams of scholars working around the clock, and analyzed for any information that might provide insight into effective supernatural containment methods. Ecclesiastical authorities were contacted at more than 60 locations, each requiring careful explanation of the threat without revealing details that might cause panic or disbelief. Most challenging of all was the recruitment of personnel willing to participate in operations that could not be fully explained and might involve considerable personal danger. The Church's resources, while extensive, did not normally include individuals trained in supernatural combat, and conventional military or police forces were poorly equipped to deal with entities that existed partially outside physical reality. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. Among the historical materials we had recovered were references to an organization that had existed within the medieval church, specifically to deal with supernatural threats, the Ordo Spiritum Sanctorum, or Order of Holy Spirits. Founded in the 12th century and dissolved during the Reformation, the order had maintained detailed records of supernatural containment procedures and had trained specialists in what modern terminology might call spiritual warfare. More remarkably, we discovered that the order had not been entirely dissolved, but had continued to exist in modified form within certain monastic communities, preserving both knowledge and personnel capable of implementing medieval containment procedures. Archbishop Davidson's inquiries revealed that nearly 24 such specialists were available for immediate deployment, along with the specialized equipment and materials their methods required. The plan we developed was necessarily complex, requiring coordinated action at multiple sites simultaneously. Teams would be positioned at every major monastic ruin in England, each equipped with the materials and knowledge necessary to disrupt supernatural activity at their assigned location. The operations would begin at sunset on October 31st and continue throughout the night, with the objective of preventing the preserved consciousnesses from completing their coordinated ritual. But even as we made these preparations, evidence accumulated that the supernatural network was aware of our intentions. Several team members reported disturbing dreams involving medieval monks who seemed to know details of our planning. Equipment disappeared or malfunctioned without apparent cause. Most troubling of all, Some participants began to experience the same temporal displacement effects that had been reported at the monastic sites, suggesting that supernatural influence was spreading beyond its traditional geographical boundaries. "They're trying to recruit our own people," Pemberton observed during our final planning session. "The preserved consciousnesses understand that direct confrontation with ecclesiastical authority is risky, so they're attempting to create willing servants from within our own organization." The infiltration was subtle but persistent. Team members would report sudden insights into medieval theology that they had never studied, along with growing sympathy for the goals of the great work. Several expressed doubts about the wisdom of opposing forces that offered transcendence beyond mortal limitations, and one team leader requested reassignment on the grounds that interfering with the supernatural ritual might constitute opposition to divine will. We responded by implementing additional screening procedures and rotating personnel to prevent extended exposure to supernatural influence, but I could not escape the suspicion that these measures were inadequate against forces that had demonstrated centuries of patience and sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The night of October 31st arrived with unseasonably clear weather and a full moon that bathed the English countryside in silver light. From my command position at Lambeth Palace, I maintained communication with teams positioned at monastic sites from Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire to Glastonbury in Somerset. Each team reported normal conditions as sunset approached, but there was an underlying tension in their communications that suggested everyone understood the unprecedented nature of what we were attempting. The supernatural activity began precisely at sunset, manifesting simultaneously at every monitored location. Teams reported the appearance of medieval monks conducting elaborate rituals among the ruins, the emergence of phosphorescent lights that moved in complex geometric patterns, and the sound of coordinated chanting that seemed to create physical effects in the surrounding atmosphere. More disturbing were the reports of temporal displacement affecting team members themselves. Several personnel found themselves experiencing vivid medieval memories and demonstrating knowledge of Latin liturgy they had never learned. In 3 cases, team members had to be physically restrained to prevent them from joining the supernatural rituals they were supposed to be disrupting. "The containment procedures are having limited effect," reported Brother Francis from Fountains Abbey. "The preserved consciousnesses appear to be drawing power from sources we cannot identify or interrupt. They're also demonstrating abilities we did not anticipate: direct influence over team members, manipulation of physical objects, and what appears to be limited control over local weather conditions." Similar reports came from other sites. The supernatural network had clearly anticipated ecclesiastical opposition and had developed countermeasures that neutralized many of our containment efforts. Worse still, the coordinated nature of their operations meant that disrupting supernatural activity at one site had minimal effect on the overall ritual. The preserved consciousnesses were operating as components of a single vast system that could compensate for localized interference. It was Brother Marcus at Gormley Abbey who provided the key insight that changed our understanding of the situation. "The ritual isn't being conducted at the monastic sites," he reported during a communication that crackled with supernatural interference. "The preserved consciousnesses are using the sites as focal points, but the actual center of operations is elsewhere. We're attempting to disrupt the periphery while the core remains untouched." The realization struck me with the force of revelation. The great work's final ritual was indeed coordinated from a central location, with the various monastic sites serving merely as amplification points for supernatural power generated elsewhere. If we could identify and disrupt that central location, the entire operation might be neutralized regardless of activity at individual sites. The answer lay in the manuscripts we had recovered from the various monastic sites, cross-referencing the temporal and geographical references contained in the posthumous writings of the preserved consciousnesses. A pattern emerged that pointed to a location we had never investigated: the ruins of St. Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury, the original foundation of English Christianity and the symbolic heart of the medieval church. Canterbury, I explained to Archbishop Davidson via telephone. The supernatural network has been using St. Augustine's Abbey as its central coordination point, hidden within the most sacred site in English Christianity. The preserved consciousnesses at other locations are channeling their power there, where it can be focused and directed by the original architects of the great work. The Archbishop's response was immediate. Then, that's where we must make our stand. I'll authorize the deployment of our reserve forces to Canterbury, along with every piece of specialized equipment we can transport. If the fate of human consciousness hangs in the balance, we cannot afford to fail. The race to Canterbury consumed the crucial hours between midnight and dawn on November 1st, while teams at other sites continued their containment efforts with limited success. Our most experienced personnel were rushed to the ancient abbey ruins, where the true battle for the future of human consciousness would be decided. What we found there exceeded even our most dire expectations, and the confrontation that followed would test the limits of both human courage and divine protection in ways that still haunt my dreams more than a decade after the events I am describing. The ruins of St. Augustine's Abbey at Canterbury presented a scene that defied both rational explanation and adequate description. As our hastily assembled team approached the ancient site in the pre-dawn hours of November 1st, we encountered atmospheric disturbances that suggested the fundamental laws governing reality were being systematically suspended. The air itself seemed thick and resistant, requiring physical effort to breathe and movement that felt like wading through invisible water. Temperature fluctuations created zones of intense cold alternating with areas of tropical warmth, often within the space of a few yards. Most disturbing of all were the temporal anomalies, glimpses of the abbey as it had existed in medieval times, complete with buildings that had been demolished centuries ago, and monks conducting services that overlapped with our present moment. The barriers between past and present have been almost completely dissolved here, Brother Francis observed. As we approached the ruins of the Abbey Church, we're not simply witnessing supernatural manifestations, we're experiencing a fundamental breakdown of temporal reality. The preserved consciousnesses responsible for this breakdown were present in unprecedented numbers, where other sites had contained individual figures or small groups. Canterbury hosted what appeared to be the entire leadership of the medieval supernatural network. Dozens of robed forms moved among the ruins with purposeful coordination, conducting an elaborate ritual that involved both the physical remains of the abbey and supernatural elements that existed outside normal spatial dimensions. At the center of this activity, positioned where the high altar of the Abbey Church had once stood, was a figure I recognized with mingled horror and fascination. Brother Augustine de Mortuo, whose brass memorial at Gormley Abbey had initiated our involvement with the great work. But this was not the static bronze effigy or the wavering apparition we had previously encountered. This was Brother Augustine in his full supernatural manifestation, radiating power that made the air around him visible with phosphorescent energy. Surrounding him were other figures I had encountered in our various investigations: Brother Dunstan from St. Bertolph's Priory, Brother Thomas from Waltham Abbey, Brother William from Fountains Abbey, and dozens of others whose preserved consciousnesses had been coordinating the great work across multiple centuries. They moved in perfect synchronization, their voices joining in a chant that seemed to resonate not merely through the air, but through the fundamental structure of reality itself. The effect of their ritual was immediately apparent in its impact on human consciousness. Every member of our team found themselves experiencing memories and knowledge that belonged to medieval monks, along with growing comprehension of supernatural principles that no living human should have possessed. More troubling still, several team members began to express open sympathy for the goals of the great work, arguing that opposition to such transcendence represented a failure to understand divine providence. The corruption is accelerating, Archbishop Davidson observed, his voice tight with strain from resisting supernatural influence. The closer we approach to the completion of their ritual, the more difficult it becomes to maintain independent human consciousness. We have perhaps an hour before the effect becomes irreversible. The challenge we faced was unprecedented in both scale and complexity. The supernatural network had concentrated centuries of accumulated power at this single location, creating a vortex of spiritual energy that threatened to overwhelm any conventional form of opposition. More problematic still was the realization that direct assault on the preserved consciousnesses might actually serve their purposes by providing the violent spiritual energy their ritual required for completion. It was Brother Francis who proposed the solution that ultimately saved both our mission and our souls. We cannot defeat them through opposition, he explained, because their power derives from conflict between spiritual forces. But medieval theology recognized another approach: redemption rather than destruction, salvation rather than conquest. The insight was profound and terrifying in its implications. Rather than attempting to destroy the preserved consciousnesses, we would need to offer them the spiritual release they had been denied for centuries. The great work, for all its supernatural sophistication, was ultimately an attempt to avoid the final judgment that awaited all human souls. If we could provide an alternative path to transcendence, one that did not require the enslavement of human consciousness, the entire network might choose redemption over domination. But such redemption would require a sacrifice of unprecedented scope. Archbishop Davidson pointed out, someone would need to serve as spiritual conductor for the release of hundreds of preserved consciousnesses, channeling their accumulated spiritual energy into consecrated rather than corrupted transcendence. The individual who attempted such a task would almost certainly be destroyed by the process. The choice, when it came, was both obvious and heartbreaking. Of all our team members, only Pemberton possessed both the theological knowledge and the spiritual authority necessary to attempt such a redemption. His experience as a country clergyman had provided him with practical understanding of spiritual counseling, while his involvement in our supernatural investigations had given him unique insight into the motivations and methods of the preserved consciousnesses. "I'll do it," he said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had marked his intervention at Gormley Abbey. "Someone must, and I appear to be the most qualified candidate. Perhaps this is why Providence guided us into these investigations, not to study supernatural forces, but to provide them with the redemption they have been seeking for centuries." The preparation for what we privately termed the Great Redemption consumed the final hour before dawn. Using materials and procedures recovered from the medieval archives, we created a consecrated space within the ruins of the Abbey Church, a spiritual sanctuary that could contain and channel the enormous energies that would be released when hundreds of preserved consciousnesses were simultaneously offered salvation. Pemberton positioned himself at the center of this consecrated space, surrounded by symbols and artifacts that represented the accumulated spiritual authority of centuries of Christian tradition. In his hands, he held the communion cup he had carried during our various investigations, now consecrated with holy water from every major shrine in England and blessed by ecclesiastical authorities representing the entire hierarchy of the Church. As the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, he began to speak, not in the formal language of liturgical services, but in the personal, conversational tone he had used during pastoral visits to his parishioners. He addressed the preserved consciousnesses not as supernatural entities to be feared or destroyed, but as human souls who had lost their way and were seeking guidance toward proper rest. "Brother Augustine," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the ruins, "and all you who have labored so long in pursuit of transcendence, the time has come to lay down your burden and accept the rest that has been prepared for you. The great work you have pursued with such dedication is not the path to eternal life, but a detour from the salvation that awaits all who choose to accept divine mercy." The effect of his words on the supernatural network was immediate and dramatic. The coordinated ritual that had been building toward culmination began to falter as individual preserved consciousness turned their attention from their collective work to Pemberton's offer of redemption. The chanting that had resonated through multiple dimensions grew irregular and discordant, and the phosphorescent energy that had surrounded Brother Augustine began to dim and fluctuate. "You offer us dissolution," Brother Augustine replied, his voice carrying the harmonics of multiple speakers. "We have labored for centuries to achieve consciousness beyond the limitations of mortal existence. Why should we abandon our work on the verge of success to accept the uncertain promise of divine judgment?" "Because," Pemberton answered with gentle authority, "the consciousness you have achieved is not truly eternal. It is a prolonged form of spiritual stasis that prevents you from progressing toward the ultimate transcendence that awaits all human souls. You have been existing, but not truly living. You have been preserving consciousness, but not experiencing the growth and development that consciousness requires. True eternal life cannot be achieved through human effort. It can only be received as a divine gift." The theological argument that followed transcended anything I had witnessed in university debates or ecclesiastical conferences. Brother Augustine and his fellow preserved consciousnesses demonstrated sophisticated understanding of spiritual principles that challenged fundamental assumptions of Christian doctrine, while Pemberton responded with insights that seemed to draw upon sources of wisdom I had never heard him express during our normal conversations. But gradually, as the dawn light grew stronger, the balance of the argument began to shift. One by one, the preserved consciousnesses began to acknowledge the spiritual stagnation of their existence and the appeal of Pemberton's offer of genuine transcendence through divine grace rather than supernatural manipulation. The first to accept redemption was Brother Thomas from Waltham Abbey. As he knelt before Pemberton and accepted the communion cup, his preserved form began to glow with warm golden light that was entirely different from the cold phosphorescence that had marked supernatural activity throughout our investigations. The light grew brighter and more radiant until his physical form dissolved entirely, leaving behind only a sense of profound peace and spiritual fulfillment. Others followed: Brother William from Fountains, Brother Dunstan from St. Botolph's, dozens of preserved consciousnesses whose names we had never learned, but whose dedication to the great work had driven centuries of supernatural activity. Each redemption released enormous spiritual energy that Pemberton somehow managed to channel into consecrated rather than destructive manifestation. though I could see the physical toll the process was taking on him. Brother Augustine was the last to accept redemption, and his capitulation marked the end of the great work as a supernatural threat to human consciousness. As he knelt before Pemberton, the accumulated power of centuries began to discharge through the consecrated space we had created, filling the ruins of St. Augustine's Abbey with light that seemed to emanate from beyond the physical world. "I have been mistaken," Brother Augustine said, his voice now entirely human and filled with emotions I had never heard from him before. "The preservation of consciousness is not the same as the enhancement of consciousness. We have been maintaining existence rather than embracing life. I accept your offer of true transcendence." As he accepted the communion cup, the final discharge of supernatural energy nearly overwhelmed our carefully prepared containment systems. The very air seemed to ignite with spiritual fire, and the ruins of the abbey were momentarily restored to their medieval glory as centuries of accumulated prayers and devotions were released in a single magnificent burst of consecrated power. When the light faded and normal reality reasserted itself, Pemberton was still standing at the center of the consecrated space, but the cost of channeling such enormous spiritual energies was immediately apparent. His hair had turned completely white, his face bore the lines of premature aging, and his eyes held a quality of profound weariness that suggested he had experienced more than any mortal consciousness should be asked to bear. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was still entirely human. The redemption of the preserved consciousness had been accomplished without the corruption or destruction we had feared, and the supernatural network that had threatened human consciousness for centuries was finally at peace. The aftermath of what the official church records termed the Canterbury incident brought both relief and a profound sense of loss that has influenced every aspect of my subsequent career. The immediate threat to human consciousness had been eliminated. Reports of supernatural activity at former monastic sites ceased entirely, and the temporal anomalies that had plagued various locations returned to normal patterns. Yet the price of this victory extended beyond the physical toll on Pemberton to encompass the loss of knowledge and perspective that our supernatural investigations had provided. In the days following November 1st, 1924, as teams returned from monastic sites across England with reports of complete cessation of supernatural phenomena, I found myself experiencing something akin to intellectual withdrawal. The expanded understanding of historical processes, the insight into forces that operated beyond conventional academic disciplines, and the sense of participating in events of cosmic significance. All of this vanished with the redemption of the preserved consciousnesses, leaving only conventional scholarship and the mundane concerns of university life. Pemberton's condition stabilized over the following weeks, though he never entirely recovered from his experience as spiritual conductor for the Great Redemption. The premature aging proved permanent, and he suffered from periodic episodes of what physicians termed spiritual exhaustion, a condition for which medical science had no adequate treatment or explanation. More troubling were the dreams he reported, in which redeemed consciousnesses would visit him to express gratitude for their release and to share final insights into the nature of existence beyond physical death. "They are at peace now," he would tell me during our regular consultations at Little Gormley Rectory, "but they remember their centuries of supernatural existence, and they understand things about the relationship between consciousness and eternity that living humans are not meant to know. Sometimes they share fragments of that knowledge, and I find myself understanding concepts that no mortal mind should comprehend." The Commission for Supernatural Affairs was quietly disbanded in the spring of 1925, its official records, sealed and distributed among various ecclesiastical archives. Archbishop Davidson expressed the Church's gratitude for our services, but he also made clear that such dramatic intervention in supernatural affairs should remain exceptional rather than routine. The medieval systems of containment had proven adequate for normal supernatural threats. Only the unprecedented scope of the great work had required the extraordinary measures we had implemented. I returned to my position at University College London, resuming lectures on medieval history and continuing research into monastic archives, though with a perspective profoundly altered by my supernatural experiences. Students and colleagues noted changes in my approach to historical materials, particularly my tendency to examine manuscript marginalia and chronicle anomalies that previous scholars had dismissed as copying errors or scribal fantasies. How could I explain that such errors might represent accurate accounts of events that conventional history was unprepared to acknowledge? The brass rubbings we had collected during our various investigations remained in my possession, though they had been rendered harmless by the redemption of the consciousnesses they had once memorialized. The images now showed ordinary medieval memorial brasses, conventional religious figures in attitudes of prayer, with inscriptions requesting prayers for the departed and commending their souls to divine mercy. No trace remained of the supernatural elements that had first drawn our attention to these monuments. Yet occasionally, when examining these rubbings by lamplight, during the long evenings that marked my return to solitary scholarship, I would glimpse something in the bronze figures that suggested awareness of my presence, a subtle alteration in expression, a slight modification in the positioning of hands, or changes in the Latin inscriptions that hinted at ongoing communication from consciousnesses that had achieved true transcendence beyond the physical world. These moments provided reassurance that our efforts had indeed accomplished redemption rather than destruction, but they also served as reminders of how much had been lost when the supernatural network was dissolved. The preserved consciousnesses had accumulated knowledge spanning centuries, insights into historical processes, understanding of natural phenomena, and theological wisdom that represented irreplaceable intellectual resources. Their redemption, while spiritually necessary, had also eliminated a unique source of knowledge about the deeper patterns that shaped human civilization. This sense of loss was particularly acute when I encountered historical mysteries that our supernatural investigations might have illuminated. Archaeological discoveries at other medieval sites, manuscript fragments that suggested unusual spiritual practices, and chronicle accounts of unexplained phenomena all reminded me of the broader perspective we had briefly possessed through our contact with the preserved consciousnesses. But there were compensations as well. The experience of confronting supernatural forces and participating in their redemption had provided insights into the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to transcendent reality that enriched my understanding of medieval theology and mystical literature. Authors whom I had previously approached as historical curiosities, Julian of Norwich, Meister Eckhart, the anonymous writer of The Cloud of Unknowing, became guides to spiritual territories I had personally explored, albeit under extraordinary circumstances. My scholarly publications began to reflect this deeper understanding, though I was careful to present insights in purely academic terms without reference to their supernatural origins. Colleagues noted an increased sophistication in my analysis of medieval religious psychology and a particular expertise in identifying authentic mystical experiences within hagiographical literature. Several universities sought my consultation on manuscripts dealing with unusual spiritual phenomena and I found myself regarded as a leading authority on what euphemistic academic language termed irregular medieval religious practices. The irony was not lost on me that my reputation as a scholar of medieval spirituality derived from experiences that no conventional academic preparation could have provided, and that the most important discoveries of my career would never be included in any official publication. The knowledge gained through supernatural investigation remained as carefully contained as the forces we had once sought to study, preserved within the memories of those few individuals who had participated in events too extraordinary for public acknowledgement. Pemberton and I maintained regular correspondence, sharing observations about the long-term effects of our supernatural encounters and monitoring for any signs that similar forces might be emerging at other locations. But as months passed into years without incident, we gradually accepted that the great work had represented a unique historical phenomenon whose elimination had removed the primary supernatural threat to human consciousness in the modern era. This conclusion proved to be premature. In the autumn of 1929, reports began reaching us of unusual phenomena at medieval sites in continental Europe, manifestations that bore disturbing similarities to the early stages of supernatural activity we had observed in England. The great work, it appeared, had not been confined to British monastic foundations, but had established operational centers throughout medieval Christendom. Our success at Canterbury had eliminated the English network, but similar preserved consciousnesses remained active in France, Germany, Italy, and other locations where medieval monasticism had achieved particular sophistication. The implications were staggering. If our interpretation was correct, we had prevented one supernatural network from achieving its goals, but other networks, possibly even more advanced, and certainly better concealed, continued to pursue the same ultimate objective of transcending human mortality through the preservation and enhancement of consciousness beyond physical death. But that realization, and the investigations it would eventually compel, must remain the subject of future accounts. The events I have described in this narrative represent the conclusion of one phase of humanity's encounter with supernatural forces seeking to reshape the fundamental nature of human existence. Whether subsequent phases will prove as amenable to redemptive resolution as the great work of medieval England remains to be determined. For now, I content myself with the knowledge that consciousness freed from supernatural manipulation has resumed its natural course toward transcendence through divine grace rather than human artifice. The preserved monks of medieval England have found the rest that eluded them for centuries, and the boundaries between life and death remain intact for future generations to negotiate through their own spiritual development rather than through the predetermined paths imposed by supernatural intelligence. Yet sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning, when the boundary between sleep and waking grows thin, I find myself wondering whether we truly defeated the forces we encountered, or whether we simply satisfied their deeper purposes by providing them with the redemption they had been seeking all along. Perhaps the great work was never intended to succeed through the preservation of human consciousness in supernatural form, but rather to test whether humanity possessed sufficient spiritual maturity to choose transcendence through divine grace over transcendence through human effort. If so, then our success at Canterbury may have represented not victory over supernatural forces, but graduation from a test whose parameters we never fully understood. The preserved consciousnesses achieved their ultimate transcendence not through centuries of supernatural manipulation, but through the willing acceptance of divine mercy offered by a humble country clergyman who understood that true eternal life cannot be grasped, but can only be received as a gift. This interpretation provides some comfort during the long nights when I reflect upon the extraordinary events that have shaped my understanding of human consciousness and its relationship to forces that operate beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. Whether future generations will face similar tests, or whether the redemption of the medieval preserved consciousnesses represents the conclusion of a unique chapter in the spiritual development of human civilization, remains to be seen. But I am confident that if such tests do arise, they will find humanity better prepared than we were, not because of superior knowledge or resources, but because the example of Pemberton's courage and compassion has demonstrated that the most powerful supernatural forces can be overcome not through opposition, but through the offer of spiritual redemption to consciousness that has lost its way in the pursuit of transcendence through human rather than divine means. The brass rubbing of Brother Augustine de Mortuo Mari rests in my study as I write these final words, no longer a supernatural artifact, but a simple memorial to human souls who found peace through divine grace rather than supernatural achievement. The bronze figure appears entirely at rest, hands folded in genuine prayer rather than grasping supplication, face serene with the peace that comes from completed rather than endless existence, and inscription reading simply, "Here lies Brother Augustine, who found eternal life through God's mercy rather than human effort." It serves as a reminder that the greatest mysteries of human existence cannot be solved through scholarly investigation alone, but require the wisdom to know when knowledge should be pursued and when it should be surrendered in favor of faith. The view from the Rectory gate encompasses not only the ruins of ancient monasteries, but the continuing presence of divine grace that offers transcendence to all who choose to accept it, making supernatural manipulation unnecessary for those who trust in promises that extend beyond both mortal life and human understanding. I have set down this account in the hope that future scholars who encounter similar phenomena will understand both the opportunities and dangers involved in investigating supernatural forces that seek to reshape human consciousness. The knowledge we gained came at considerable cost, and the redemption we achieved required sacrifice that few would be willing or able to make. Yet the outcome demonstrated that even the most sophisticated supernatural intelligence cannot ultimately prevail against human souls guided by divine grace and motivated by compassion for consciousness that has lost its way in the pursuit of transcendence through its own efforts rather than through acceptance of gifts that exceed all human deserving. Should similar investigations become necessary, let them be conducted with proper ecclesiastical authority and with full understanding that the goal should always be redemption rather than destruction of supernatural consciousness. No matter how corrupted its manifestation may appear, the preserved monks of medieval England taught us that centuries of supernatural existence cannot eliminate the human soul's fundamental need for divine mercy, and that even the most elaborate attempts to achieve transcendence through human effort ultimately serve only to demonstrate the superiority of transcendence received as divine gift. The great work has ended, but the greater work of spiritual development continues for each human soul that chooses to pursue transcendence through faith rather than through supernatural manipulation of consciousness beyond its natural boundaries. May future generations prove worthy of the redemption that was purchased at such cost during those extraordinary nights when the boundaries between past and present, natural and supernatural, human effort and divine grace were tested and ultimately strengthened through the triumph of love over the desire to transcend mortality through means that would have enslaved rather than liberated human consciousness.